Go ahead. If you are so brave, just leave. My sister challenged me, claiming I would not survive a single week without the family name protecting me. I did not scream or argue. I simply dropped the house keys and my untouched family credit card straight into her crystal champagne glass. By the very next morning, my phone was blowing up with 86 missed calls and their entire fake empire was completely frozen. My name is Maya. I am 32 years old, and for my entire life, my family treated me like the ungrateful outcast because I refused to be a pawn in their real estate schemes. What they did not know was that the quiet, boring bookkeeper they constantly mocked actually owned the very ground they walked on. If you have ever been the black sheep who ended up running the whole pasture, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe because you will want to see exactly how I burned their facade to ashes. Put it down, Maya. Your little bookkeeping salary cannot digest truffles. Vanessa actually reached across the imported linen tablecloth and snatched the bone china plate right out of my hands. I sat there in the massive dining room of my parents' Atlanta estate, the air thick with the smell of roasted garlic, honey, glazed ham, and performative wealth. My sister, 2 years older and dripping in jewelry, bought with my parents' money, looked at me with pure disgust. She owned a luxury spa downtown, funded entirely by our father, and never missed a chance to remind everyone that she was a self-made businesswoman. Chad, Vanessa's husband, leaned back in his chair with that familiar patronizing smirk. He was a white crypto bro who loved to explain basic business concepts to anyone who did not ask. He specifically targeted me with his subtle grating remarks, always trying to assert his dominance in a black household that worshipped him simply for his proximity to supposed corporate success. "Come on," Vanessa, Chad drawled, swirling his bourbon. "Let her eat. She probably lives on instant ramen and tap water in that rented shoebox of hers. It is Christmas. Let us do our charity for the year." I looked at Chad. I looked at the smug satisfaction radiating from his pale, perfectly moisturized face. For years I had bitten my tongue to keep the peace. I had ignored the microaggressions. I had ignored how he slowly drained my parents' resources to fund his lavish lifestyle and his fake wealth management firm. But today, listening to him call me a charity case while he ate food paid for by my family, something inside me finally snapped. "That is highly generous of you, Chad," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. "Especially considering that Swiss luxury watch you are wearing ticks loud enough for me to hear it from across the table." Real automatic movements sweep Chad. They do not tick like a $20 knockoff from a strip mall kiosk. The entire table froze. The clanking of silverware against expensive china stopped abruptly. Chad's face turned a violent shade of red, and he instinctively covered his wrist with his opposite hand, his eyes darting around the room in a panic. Before he could stammer out a pathetic defense, my mother Joyce slammed her palms down on the mahogany table. The crystal water goblets rattled violently. "Maya Elise Marcus," she hissed, her voice vibrating with that deep, authoritative church lady indignation. "You will apologize to the man of the house this instant. How dare you bring your bitter single woman energy into my home on Christmas and disrespect your brother-in-law?" I stared at my mother, refusing to break eye contact. "He insulted my living situation, Mom. And you are demanding I apologize to him." "He was joking," she snapped, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "Something you would understand if you were not such a miserable spinster. This is exactly why you are sitting here alone. You refused to join the family real estate business. You turned your back on the Marcus empire to go work some entry-level calculator job. You bring absolutely no value to this family, and yet you sit here judging a successful wealth manager like Chad." I took a slow, deep breath to steady my racing heart. The Marcus Empire, a collection of commercial properties and soul food restaurants that my parents paraded around Atlanta like they were royalty. They loved to remind everyone that they were pillars of the community. They loved to remind me that my forensic accounting degree was a waste of their time because I refused to cook their books and cover up their messy financial habits. My father, Marcus, sat at the head of the table carving the roast, saying absolutely nothing. His silence was his endorsement. He always let my mother handle the dirty work of keeping me in line. Vanessa sneered, leaning heavily into Chad's shoulder as if to protect him from my words. She is just jealous, Mom. She has always been jealous of what I have. Go ahead and leave if you are so brave, Maya. Walk out that door right now. I bet you would not survive a single week in this city without the Marcus family name protecting you. You would be begging to come back and fetch my coffee by New Year's. I did not yell. I did not cry. I calmly picked up my heavy linen napkin, dabbed the corners of my mouth, and set it neatly beside my empty place setting. I stood up from the antique dining chair, smoothing down the front of my bespoke suit, a custom-tailored piece that cost more than Chad's entire counterfeit wardrobe. I reached into my designer bag, which they had always assumed was a cheap imitation, and pulled out the heavy brass keys to my parents' house. Next to it, I pulled out the black emergency family credit card my father had given me a decade ago. A card I had never swiped a single time because I preferred to build my own wealth. I walked slowly over to Vanessa's side of the table. She looked up at me, a triumphant smirk playing on her glossy lips, fully expecting me to apologize, cry, or storm out in a fit of emotional rage. Instead, I held my hand over her crystal champagne flute and dropped the house keys and the credit card directly into her drink. The bubbly liquid splashed up over the rim, ruining the silk bodice of her expensive dress. "Keep your rotting empire," I said, my voice perfectly calm but carrying clearly through the silent room. "I do not need your name, your money, or your charity." I turned and walked out the front door into the freezing December air, leaving the sound of— He did not move. Instead, he leaned closer, trying to use his height and his physical presence to intimidate me. This was the exact tactic he had used for years to dominate my father in business meetings, to silence my mother, and to keep Vanessa completely under his thumb. He thrived on the unearned authority my family handed him, simply because he was a white man in a tailored suit who used big financial buzzwords they did not bother to research. But I was not my parents, and I was certainly not Vanessa. "Listen to me, you angry black woman." He spat the words out like venom, finally letting his true colors show. "You think because you got a fancy new title at some boutique accounting firm you can play God with my family. You think you can just walk in here and lock up our assets. You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. I play golf with federal judges, Maya. I sit on charity boards with the banking commissioners of this state. I know the people who write the laws you pretend to enforce. You unfreeze those accounts today, or I swear I will make one phone call and have your CPA license revoked permanently. You will never work in this industry again. You will be back to serving waffles before the weekend is over." For a moment, I just looked at him. I looked at his bloodshot eyes, his trembling jaw, the sheer pathetic audacity of his threat. He honestly believed he held the power. He honestly believed that the system he was trying to weaponize against me would protect him from the mess he had created. I tilted my head back and laughed. It was not a chuckle or a polite giggle. It was a deep, genuine laugh that bounced off the concrete pillars of the garage. Chad stepped back, momentarily disoriented by my reaction. He expected me to yell. He expected me to argue. He expected me to fit perfectly into the stereotype he had just tried to box me into. My laughter broke his script entirely. "Golf with federal judges, Chad," I asked, wiping a single tear of amusement from the corner of my eye. "Is that what you tell Vanessa when you disappear for 4 days at a time? Do you tell my father you are networking with banking commissioners when you are actually sweating through your shirt at a high-stakes poker table?" I unclasped the gold latch of my leather briefcase. "You do not know anyone in the federal judiciary, Chad. You do not even have a valid Series 7 license to trade securities. You failed the exam 3 times. I know because I pulled your permanent academic record last Tuesday." His blotchy red face suddenly began to drain of color. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, taking another step back. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick, bound folder containing the preliminary findings of the Obsidian Holdings forensic audit. I did not hand it to him politely. I slammed the heavy document directly against his chest, forcing him to grab it before it fell to the floor. "I am talking about your bookie, Chad." I said, stepping into his personal space and forcing him to look me in the eye. I am talking about the offshore sports betting syndicate you have been funneling my parents' money into for the last 36 months. Did you honestly believe no one would ever check the ledger? Did you think because my father is too proud to admit he does not understand commercial real estate financing, that you could just bleed his empire dry without leaving a paper trail? Chad opened the folder. His eyes darted across the highlighted spreadsheets, the wire transfer receipts, the IP address logs. The paper trembled in his hands as the reality of his situation crushed the last remaining ounce of his fake bravado. You told my parents you were diversifying their restaurant assets into a high-yield growth portfolio. I continued, my voice sharp and clinical, cutting through him like a scalpel. But you were not buying bonds, Chad. You were covering your massive losses at the roulette table. You used the deeds to my father's soul food restaurants as collateral for a crypto firm that you knew was under federal investigation. That firm filed for bankruptcy yesterday morning. The bank is calling in the debt. That is why the accounts are frozen. You did not just lose your money, Chad. You lost everything they spent 30 years building. This is illegal, he whispered, his voice cracking. You hacked my private accounts. I will sue you. You cannot sue the senior partner of the private equity firm that just bought your debt for pennies on the dollar. I replied smoothly. I own the paper on you, Chad. I own every single lie you ever told. He looked up at me, his white privilege and country club arrogance completely evaporated, leaving nothing but a terrified little boy facing the consequences of his own greed. Please, Maya. He choked out the word, looking around the empty garage as if hoping someone would save him. You cannot tell Vanessa. You cannot tell your father. They will kill me. I will find a way to pay it back. I just need a little time to move some investments around. I reached out and gently tapped the cover of the folder he was holding. Move what investments around, Chad? Do you mean the trust fund my father set up for Vanessa? The one she thinks is sitting safely in a high-yield savings account for her future children. Chad's breath hitched. He stopped moving entirely. I leaned in close enough to smell the stale alcohol radiating from his pores. Tell me, Chad, if you are going to pay them back, why did $2 million from Vanessa's trust fund just get wired to a shell company in the Cayman Islands at 2 in the morning? And why is that shell company registered under your mother's maiden name? His face went completely ghost white. His legs literally gave out for a fraction of a second, forcing him to lean heavily against the concrete pillar to stop himself from collapsing onto the floor. He could not form words. His mouth opened and closed in silent terror as the trap snapped shut around his neck. You are not a wealth manager, Chad, I said, opening my car door and sliding into the driver's seat. You are just a common thief who got lucky enough to find a family desperate enough for validation to let you through the front door. And now I am the one locking it behind you. I started the engine, the deep roar of the custom motor echoing through the garage. I rolled down the window, looking at the pathetic shell of a man trembling in the shadows. You better run fast, Chad, I said, shifting into gear, because the bank is the least of your problems right now. I drove out of the underground garage, leaving him suffocating in the dark. The scent of chlorine and old money hung heavy in the humid air at the Oak Ridge Country Club. It was the kind of place where the sweet tea was weak, and the smiles from the patrons were even weaker. Less than 24 hours after I left my brother-in-law, Chad, trembling and sweating in an underground parking garage, my mother, Joyce, summoned me here. She did not send a polite request or a motherly invitation. She sent a summons. Her text message consisted of exactly one demanding sentence. Meet me at the club at noon, and do not embarrass me by dressing poorly. I decided to wear a tailored crimson-red pantsuit that cost more than her annual country club membership dues, because if I was going to attend a circus, I might as well dress like the ringmaster. I found her sitting on the shaded veranda overlooking the lush green of the 18th hole. She was wearing her oversized designer sunglasses and aggressively stirring a violently pink cocktail with a plastic swizzle stick. She did not stand when I approached the table. She did not offer a hug or a greeting. She did not even apologize for screaming at me in the middle of a crowded bank lobby the day before. Instead, she pushed a thick manila folder across the wrought iron table before I even had the chance to pull out my chair. I need you to co-sign a personal loan, she said, her voice clipped and demanding, ringing with absolute entitlement. $500,000. The paperwork is already filled out completely. I just need your signature on the bottom line and your proof of income from whatever little accounting job you have. I slowly sat down, crossing my legs and looking at the folder as if it were a dead rat rotting in the sun. I did not reach for it. I did not even lean forward. I simply looked up at the waiter who had rushed over to our table, sensing the arrival of a new guest to serve. I will take a bottle of your reserve Cabernet, I told him smoothly. The vintage from Napa Valley, please. Yes, the $200 bottle. And please charge it directly to my mother's member account tab. The waiter nodded eagerly and scurried off toward the bar. My mother glared at me from behind her dark lenses, her jaw tight with irritation. Do you really need to order a $200 bottle of wine in the middle of the day, Maya? She scoffed. I am trying to have a serious family discussion with you about our finances. I smiled, folding my hands neatly on my lap. I am just celebrating Mom. Now please tell me why on earth you need $500,000 of my supposedly worthless bookkeeping salary. I thought the Marcus Empire was completely untouchable. I thought you and Dad had more money than God. She let out a long, exasperated sigh, acting as though my very existence was a heavy burden she was graciously tolerating for the afternoon. It is just a temporary cash flow issue, Maya. Chad has all of his capital tied up in some very aggressive offshore investments right now. He is waiting for the massive returns to clear international customs. But in the meantime, Vanessa is facing a slight delay with her spa operating costs. You know how these commercial landlords are in Atlanta. They have absolutely no patience. They do not understand the luxury service industry at all. She needs a bridge loan to keep the doors open, and since you apparently have been hoarding your paychecks instead of contributing to this family, you are going to step up and help your sister. The sheer audacity of her delusion was almost suffocating. She was sitting there at a country club while her husband's business was actively crumbling into dust. Her son-in-law was actively stealing millions from her, and she was trying to force me to take on massive debt just to fund Vanessa's failing vanity project. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool metal of the table. So let me get this straight, Mom. You want me to take out a $500,000 loan in my own name to save a day spa that has not turned a single dollar of profit since it opened its doors. You want me to bail out Vanessa because her husband is too busy wiring your retirement funds to shell companies in the Caribbean to pay his own wife's bills. Do not you dare speak about Chad that way, my mother hissed, slamming her open palm against the table just like she did at our Christmas dinner. Chad is a provider for this family. He is a financial visionary. You are just bitter because no man of his caliber has ever looked twice at you. You have always been selfish, Maya, always keeping score like a petty child. I went through 36 hours of agonizing labor with you. I almost died on that delivery table bringing you into this world. I sacrificed my youth, my beautiful body, and my peace of mind to raise you, and you sit here refusing to help your own flesh and blood. You owe me your life. You owe this family your loyalty. The waiter returned at that exact moment, placing the expensive bottle of red wine on the table and pouring me a generous glass. He handed the leather receipt pad to my mother. She snatched the pen and scribbled her signature across the bottom line, shoving it back at him with an irritated flick of her wrist. Thank you, I said, taking a slow, deliberate sip of the wine. It was rich and complex, tasting much better than the bitter flavor of my mother's endless guilt trips. I placed the crystal glass down on the table and looked her dead in the eye, dropping my polite smile. I do not owe you anything, Mom. You did not sacrifice your youth for me. You hired a cheap nanny to raise me while you spent your days at church luncheons, pretending to care about the less fortunate. You threw me into underfunded public schools while you paid for Vanessa's elite private academy because you said my personality was too abrasive to fit in with high society kids. You told me I had to earn my keep by washing dishes while you handed Vanessa a business she did not even know how to run. You never gave me a dime. And now you expect me to mortgage my entire future to save her past. The answer is no. My mother's face twisted into an ugly, terrifying mask of panic and pure fury. She ripped her sunglasses off her face, revealing eyes that were wide and frantic. "You cannot say no," she screamed, abandoning her pristine country club etiquette entirely. Her voice echoed across the quiet veranda, drawing shocked stares from the wealthy patrons sitting at the surrounding tables. "You do not understand what is happening, Maya. If you do not sign this loan today, Vanessa will lose everything. The landlord is completely ruthless. He sent a final notice yesterday morning. He is threatening full eviction by the end of the week. Do you know what that will do to our reputation in this city? Vanessa's spa is a staple in this community. She will be a public laughingstock. You have to talk to the landlord. You have to use your corporate connections to buy us some time." I picked up my wine glass again, swirling the dark red liquid and watching the sunlight catch the edges of the crystal. I took another slow, satisfying sip before setting it down gently on the coaster. "I do not need to talk to the landlord, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, deadly whisper that cut right through her screaming. "I know exactly how ruthless the landlord is." "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her chest heaving as she gripped the edges of the wrought iron table with trembling hands. "I bought that entire commercial plaza 3 months ago through one of my private holding companies," I told her, watching the color completely drain from her face until she looked like a ghost. "I am the landlord, and Vanessa has not paid her rent in 6 months. So you can tell your perfect golden child to pack up her flat irons, her massage tables, and her fake holistic healing crystals by Friday. Because if she is not out of my building by 5 in the afternoon, my private security team is going to throw her entire inventory directly into the dumpster." My mother sat there completely paralyzed, her mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out, like she was suffocating on dry land. "Oh, and Mom," I added, standing up from the table and smoothing the front of my suit jacket, "you might want to call an Uber to get home. That premium member account you just tried to charge this $200 bottle of wine to. The bank froze it at 9 this morning. I suggest you run before the club manager comes out here to ask you why your credit card just declined." I turned and walked away, leaving her sitting alone with a bounce check and eviction notice and the absolute certainty that her golden era was officially over. It was Friday afternoon, and the clock was ticking closer to 5. Instead of packing up her inventory like a rational business owner facing a legal eviction, Vanessa decided to double down on her favorite currency, which was public sympathy. I sat in the back of my idling town car across the street from the extravagant glass storefront of her salon, watching the entire disaster unfold on my phone screen. Vanessa was broadcasting live on Instagram to her 100,000 followers. She had set up her professional ring light right in the middle of the waiting area, perfectly framing the imported Italian marble reception desk and the cascading floral chandelier behind her. She was wearing a silk designer blouse and dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the persecuted victim to absolute perfection. "You guys do not understand what I am going through right now," she sniffled into the camera, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "I built this luxury spa from the ground up. This is a proudly Black-owned business, a safe space for our community. And now my own flesh and blood is trying to tear it down. My jealous demonic sister is trying to illegally steal my property. She has always hated me. She has always been obsessed with destroying my happiness, and now she is using shady corporate loopholes to lock me out of my own salon." I watched the comments flood the screen on my phone. Hundreds of strangers were leaving angry emojis, praying hands, and messages of blind support. They were calling me a sellout, a corporate monster, and a jealous hater. Vanessa ate it up, nodding tragically as she read the comments aloud. "Please share this live stream," she pleaded, clutching her chest. "Do not let corporate greed destroy a small business. Do not let her silence me." I locked the screen on my phone and slipped it into my pocket. The time for warnings had officially expired. I stepped out of the town car and smoothed the front of my bespoke navy blue suit. The fabric was immaculate, the cut sharp and unforgiving. I signaled to the 2 armed security guards I had hired from a private tactical firm. They were built like brick walls, dressed in solid black, and they fell perfectly into step right behind me as I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the salon. The immediate atmosphere inside the spa was chaotic. Clients in plush white robes were sitting in the waiting area looking confused, while a few nervous stylists hovered near the hallway, unsure of what to do. The soothing ambient spa music was entirely drowned out by Vanessa's continuous theatrical sobbing to her digital audience. She did not even notice me walk in until the heavy thud of my security guard's boots echoed across the marble floor. Vanessa froze. The fake tears instantly vanished, replaced by a look of genuine panic. She glanced at the two massive guards flanking me, and then at the leather folder in my hand. But true to her nature, she quickly remembered the camera was still rolling. She snatched her phone off the ring light mount and pointed the lens directly at me, using her audience as a human shield. "Look at this, everyone," she yelled, her voice shrill and echoing off the mirrored walls. "Look at what my sister is doing. She brought armed thugs into my place of business. Get the camera right on her face. Maya, you are trespassing. I have 100,000 people watching you right now. You are going to be ruined by the time this video goes viral. Get out of my salon before I call the police." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I walked at a slow and deliberate pace, right up to the marble reception desk. The clients in the waiting area were dead silent, holding their breath, as I stepped fully into the frame of her live broadcast. I looked directly into the camera lens she was shoving in my face and offered a calm, pleasant smile. "Hello, everyone," I said, my voice projecting clearly through the quiet room. "Since my sister decided to bring you all into our family business, I think it is only fair that you get the full and accurate financial picture. Vanessa here claims I am a jealous sister trying to steal her proudly Black-owned business. What she forgot to mention to her lovely followers is that this business is entirely funded by our parents, and she does not actually own the building." "Shut up, Maya," Vanessa screamed, trying to yank the phone away, but I stepped closer, pinning her in place with a cold, unyielding glare. "I own this building." I continued, speaking directly to her audience. "I bought this entire commercial plaza 3 months ago through my private equity firm. And as the legal owner, I can confirm that this luxury spa has not paid a single dime of rent in 6 consecutive months. That is half a year of operating a business for free, while the actual landlord foots the bill for the water, the electricity, and the property taxes." Vanessa's face went completely ashen. She looked at her phone screen, where the comments had suddenly shifted from blind support to wild confusion. The narrative she had spent the last 30 minutes spinning was unraveling in real time. "You are lying," she stammered, lowering the phone slightly. "My husband handles the commercial leases. Chad handles all of our investments. The payments are in an escrow account." I let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Chad does not handle investments, Vanessa. Chad handles offshore gambling accounts. If you want to know where your rent money went, I highly suggest you ask him why he wired $2 million from your personal trust fund to a shell company in the Cayman Islands yesterday morning." The silence in the salon was absolute. Even the ambient music seemed to have stopped. The stylists were staring at Vanessa with wide eyes, realizing that their paychecks were probably gone forever. Vanessa stood frozen behind her expensive marble desk, the phone trembling violently in her hand. The reality of her husband's betrayal and her own financial ruin was hitting her all at once, and the camera was capturing every single agonizing second of it. I pulled the heavy stack of legal documents from my leather folder and slapped it down onto the marble desk. The sound cracked like a whip in the quiet room. "You have not paid rent in 6 months, Vanessa," I said, keeping my tone completely even and perfectly professional. "The grace period expired at noon. The eviction is fully executed and legally binding. Security is here to escort you off my property." I leaned in slightly, making sure my final words were picked up clearly by her microphone. "Say bye to your followers." Sunday morning arrived with the heavy and suffocating humidity typical of Atlanta in the summer. I walked into the grand sanctuary of Greater Hope Fellowship Church, knowing exactly what kind of trap was waiting for me. My parents had attended this specific church for over 2 decades, using it as a stage for their social climbing and a convenient shield for their shady commercial real estate practices. I slid into a wooden pew at the very back of the room, watching my father stand in the front row with his hands raised high in performative worship. My mother stood right beside him wearing an elaborate wide-brimmed hat and a custom-tailored dress, projecting the flawless image of a devout and incredibly blessed matriarch. They thought they were safe here among the choir and the stained glass. They thought the walls of this sanctuary would protect them from the brutal financial consequences of their actions. But I did not come to pray today. I came to watch the final structural pillar of their fake empire crumble to dust. The service concluded with Pastor Williams delivering a fiery and pointed sermon about family unity and the sacred duty of children to submit to their parents. It was so transparently orchestrated and directed at me that I almost laughed right there in the quiet pew. As the massive congregation began filing out into the main fellowship hall for the post-service reception, I felt a heavy and deliberate hand land on my shoulder. It was Deacon Hayes, flanked by two other senior deacons, and Pastor Williams himself. Standing right behind them were my parents, looking exactly like exhausted martyrs who had just endured a terrible and unjust tragedy. My father had his head bowed in mock sorrow, while my mother dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a delicate lace handkerchief. They had corralled me right in the middle of the crowded hall, ensuring that at least 50 prominent church members were watching our interaction. Maya the pastor began, his voice booming across the large room to ensure everyone could hear his reprimand. Your parents came to me this morning with very heavy hearts. They told me about the terrible discord you have suddenly sown in your family. They told me about the ruthless financial attacks you have launched against your own flesh and blood just to prove a point. The entire hall went completely silent. Women stopped pouring coffee at the refreshment tables, and men lowered their voices to listen to the unfolding drama. The pastor placed a hand over his heart, looking at me with an expression of deep pastoral disappointment. Scripture tells us to honor our father and mother Maya. It tells us to show grace and forgive debts. You have been blessed with immense resources, but you are using them to destroy the very people who gave you life and raised you. You need to release the holds on their bank accounts and forgive the commercial loans you bought. You need to submit to your father's leadership and restore this family before the Lord turns his face from you. I looked at the pastor and then at the circle of older deacons who were nodding their heads in solemn agreement. I looked past them at my father, who had finally lifted his head to give me a smug and victorious glare. He truly believed that public religious shame would force me into submission. He thought the heavy weight of the church community would crush my resolve and make me hand back his stolen wealth out of sheer embarrassment. He relied on the old and tired tactic of using religion to silence women who dared to demand basic accountability. I did not lower my head in shame. I did not shrink away from the staring crowd of churchgoers. I simply smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal blazer and took a slow, deliberate step forward, bridging the gap between myself and the men trying to intimidate me. Honor my father and mother. Pastor. I asked, my voice ringing out clear and steady, slicing through the heavy silence of the room. Let us talk about honor. Let us talk about the time I was 24 years old and working 3 grueling jobs just to pay my rent. I found out I had a tumor in my abdomen and needed immediate and invasive surgery. I was terrified and completely broke. I came to my parents begging for a small loan to cover the medical deductibles so I would not lose my apartment while I recovered in bed. The congregation leaned in closer, hanging on every single word I spoke. My mother's face began to twitch uncontrollably, her performative sorrow suddenly replaced by genuine and rising panic. Do you remember what they did? Pastor, I continued, taking another step toward him, keeping my posture completely straight. They brought me to this very altar and had you lay hands on me. They told the entire congregation to pray for my healing because the family was going through a tight financial season and could not afford to help me with a single dollar. I survived that surgery by taking on massive credit card debt that took me years of working night shifts to pay off. But the very next month, my father bought Chad a brand new Porsche for his birthday. He bought a luxury European sports car for a white con artist who was already stealing from him, while his own biological daughter was recovering from major surgery in a rented shoebox, eating cheap canned soup because she could not afford groceries. A collective and audible gasp rippled through the fellowship hall. Several older women in the back row began whispering furiously to each other behind their hands. The deacons shifted their weight uncomfortably, exchanging nervous and shocked glances. The pristine image of the generous and devoted Marcus family was fracturing right before their eyes. My father stepped forward, his face flushing a dangerous and violent shade of crimson. "You will not disrespect us in the house of the Lord, Maya," he bellowed, trying to use his sheer volume to regain control of the room. "We have given hundreds of thousands of dollars to this church over the years. We are pillars of this community. You are nothing but a bitter and resentful child, making up wild lies because you are jealous of your sister's successful husband." I smiled. It was the same cold and detached smile I had given Chad in the dark parking garage. I unclasped my designer leather handbag and reached inside. My fingers closed around a thick stack of official documents printed on high-quality paper. I pulled them out and held them up for everyone in the room to see clearly. "Pillars of the community," I repeated softly, allowing the words to hang in the air. "That is a very interesting choice of words, Dad." I turned my attention back to the clergyman who was now sweating profusely under the stiff collar of his robes. "Pastor Williams, my father loves to remind everyone about his incredible generosity. He loves to sit in the VIP front row and be praised for his philanthropic heart." I took the heavy stack of papers and pressed them directly into the pastor's hands. He took them instinctively, looking down at the bold federal headers printed on the top pages. "Those are the official tax filings for the Marcus Empire for the last fiscal year." I explained, my voice carrying effortlessly to the very back of the room. "My private equity firm audited every single line of their corporate and personal accounts. Pastor, before you stand in front of this entire congregation and judge me for not submitting to my father's leadership, you might want to look at page 4. You might want to ask my father why the $100,000 youth center donation he bragged about all of last year was claimed as a massive charitable tax deduction on his federal returns. Because according to the forensic audit we just completed, that check never actually cleared your bank's routing numbers. He claimed a massive federal tax break for a charity donation he never actually paid you." The pastor looked down at the financial papers and then slowly looked up at my father. The silence in the fellowship hall was absolute and suffocating. My father took a step backward, his mouth opening but producing absolutely no sound, as the entire church community realized they had been bowing down to a fraud. The heavy oak doors of my executive suite swung open with a violent crash. It was past 8 in the evening, and the corporate floors of my building were supposed to be completely empty. I did not flinch from my leather chair. I simply looked up from my laptop as Chad stumbled into my office looking like a hunted animal. The pristine country club prince was completely gone. His custom Italian suit was wrinkled and stained with sweat. His tie was loosened, and his usually perfect hair was plastered to his forehead in damp, erratic clumps. He quickly turned around and shoved the heavy deadbolt into place, locking us inside the room. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he stared at me across the expanse of my polished mahogany desk. He expected me to scream or reach for a panic button. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms and waiting. I knew he would come crawling to me eventually. Rats always scramble for the highest ground when the ship starts taking on water. "I need a way out, Maya," he breathed, pacing the length of my Persian rug. His voice was frantic, lacking all the smug superiority he usually directed at me during family dinners. "The church stunt you pulled yesterday set everything on fire. The IRS is going to start looking into Marcus within the week, and once they open those books, the entire family is going to federal prison." I watched him pace my face, an absolute mask of calm. "And how exactly does this concern me, Chad? I have my own accounts. My money is clean. If my father goes to prison for tax fraud, that is a bed he built himself." Chad stopped pacing and slammed his hands down on the edge of my desk, leaning in close. The smell of stale scotch and raw fear radiated off of him. "Because I can hand you the exact matches they need," he whispered, his eyes wide and manic. "I have the real ledgers, Maya. I have every single cooked book, Every shell company transaction, every fake charitable donation your father ever filed. I have it all on an encrypted drive in my pocket. And I have paperwork signing over Vanessa's remaining equity in the commercial properties directly to you. It is everything you need to completely bury them and take total control of the Marcus estate. He let out a ragged breath, trying to force a charming smile that looked more like a grimace. I will give it all to you right now. I just need $500,000 wired to an offshore account in the Bahamas. Just give me the cash to disappear, and I will leave them all to burn. The sheer audacity of his proposal hung in the quiet air of my office. He was actively trying to sell out the very people who had funded his lavish lifestyle for the past 5 years. I looked at this man who my parents had worshipped. They had paraded him around their country clubs and church groups as the ultimate prize. They treated him like a financial visionary simply because he wore a nice suit and spoke with unearned confidence. I slowly stood up from my chair, resting my fingertips on the cool wood of my desk. "You are truly pathetic, Chad," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady register that made him flinch. "You thought you were so incredibly smart. You looked at a wealthy black family and you saw an open vault. You played the perfect son-in-law, the charming provider, and they were so blinded by their own arrogance that they handed you the keys to their entire kingdom. You have been leeching off my parents' retirement funds and draining my sister's accounts for years just to maintain your illusion of wealth. And now that the money is gone and the feds are circling, you want me to fund your escape." His fake smile instantly vanished. The polite country club facade shattered, revealing the ugly, bitter core of who he really was. He glared at me, his hands balling into tight fists at his sides. "Do not act like you are so morally superior, Maya." He spat, his voice dripping with pure, unfiltered venom. "Your family practically begged me to take their money. They wanted a white knight to show off to their rich friends, and I played the part perfectly. Do you have any idea how exhausting it has been pretending to care about them? Do you know what it is like being married to Vanessa?" He threw his hands up in the air, pacing aggressively again. "She is a shallow, high-maintenance headache. She is completely obsessed with her fake social media life and her luxury spa that bleeds money every single day. She is stupid, Maya. She never once read a single financial document I asked her to sign. She just signed whatever I put in front of her, as long as I kept buying her designer bags and telling her she was beautiful. I had to drain those accounts just to keep her quiet and happy. I never loved her. I just tolerated her because she was my blank check. And now the check has bounced. So you are going to give me the $500,000, Maya, because you hate them just as much as I do." I let him finish his arrogant rant. I let the silence stretch out, allowing his cruel and hateful words to fully settle into the space between us. He stood there panting, expecting me to pull out a checkbook and reward him for his treachery. Instead, I calmly reached across my desk. I rested my finger over the silver console of my office phone. I looked Chad dead in the eye and pressed the speaker button. "Did you get all that, Vanessa?" I asked clearly. For a moment, there was only the sound of heavy static. Then a guttural, agonizing scream ripped through the speaker. It was the sound of a woman whose entire reality had just been violently torn apart. Vanessa was wailing, crying so hard she was choking on her own breath. Chad froze. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a chalk-white ghost. His eyes darted to the phone console and then back to me, completely wide with absolute terror. He realized in that exact moment that he had not just walked into my office to make a deal. He had walked directly into his own execution. I had conferenced her in the moment security alerted me that he was in the building. She had heard every single word. She heard him call her stupid. She heard him admit to stealing her money. She heard him say he never loved her and only used her as a blank check. Chad staggered backward, stumbling over his own feet as Vanessa's hysterical sobbing echoed through the sterile office. His mouth opened, but he was completely speechless. The man who had spent 5 years talking his way out of every consequence finally had absolutely nothing left to say. The private elevator chimed softly, signaling an arrival I had already approved through the downstairs concierge. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, looking out over the glittering Atlanta skyline. The city looked beautiful at night, an endless sea of lights that I had conquered entirely on my own terms. The heavy mahogany doors of my foyer flew open, and my father marched into my home like a conquering general who had just discovered a rebellion in his ranks. Marcus did not bother taking off his coat or acknowledging the sheer scale of the home I had bought with my own money. He was practically vibrating with rage, his face a deep, mottled shade of purple. He pointed a thick, heavy finger directly at me as he crossed the expansive living room, his heavy footsteps sinking into my custom rugs. "You are going to stop this nonsense right now, Maya," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You have humiliated your mother at the country club. You have embarrassed our family in front of our entire church congregation. And you have somehow terrorized Chad to the point where he is refusing to answer my phone calls. I do not know what kind of petty vindictive game you think you are playing, but it ends tonight." I turned away from this window, keeping my face completely blank. I watched him pace back and forth, waving his arms in the air, performing the exact same intimidating patriarchal routine he had used to keep my mother and sister in line for decades. He was so used to everyone bowing down to his booming voice that he genuinely thought he could just storm into my penthouse and command me to fall back into line. "I am the head of this family," he shouted, slapping his chest with his open palm. "I built the Marcus Empire from absolutely nothing. I put the food in your mouth. I put the clothes on your back. I gave you the name that allowed you to open whatever little bookkeeping business you are running up here. You owe me everything. So here is what is going to happen. You are going to come back to my corporate office on Monday morning. You will take a position as my junior accountant. You will fix whatever tax mess you claim Chad made, and you will apologize to your sister. Do this, and I will graciously forgive your blatant disrespect." He stopped pacing and stood there, crossing his arms over his chest, waiting for me to lower my eyes and accept his generous offer. He actually expected me to abandon my own firm and crawl back to his crumbling business to work an entry-level job just to save his fragile ego. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or argue with his ridiculous demands. I simply walked over to the custom wet bar built into the corner of my living room. I reached past the expensive bottles of aged scotch and single malt bourbon, picking up a cheap plastic bottle of generic whiskey I kept specifically for cooking. I poured 2 fingers of the harsh amber liquid into a simple glass tumbler and walked back across the room, offering it to him. "Take a drink, Dad," I said softly. "You are going to need it." He glared at the glass, refusing to take it, his pride keeping his arms firmly crossed. "I am not here to drink with you, Maya. I gave you an order." I placed the glass down on the marble kitchen island and rested both of my hands on the cool, smooth surface. "You did not build an empire, Dad?" I said, my voice completely calm and level, shattering his booming echoes. "You built a Ponzi scheme, and you were too arrogant to even realize you were the main victim." His eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "How dare you speak to me about business?" he snarled, stepping closer to the island. "I own the most profitable commercial restaurant group in this city. My properties generate millions." I slowly opened the top drawer of the kitchen island and pulled out a thick, heavy dossier bound in dark leather. I slid it across the polished marble, stopping right in front of his hands. "You did not read the fine print when Chad made you sign those expansion loans, did you?" I asked, watching the confusion finally begin to crack his arrogant mask. "You just signed wherever he put the little yellow sticky notes because you loved the idea of expanding your territory. You loved sitting behind your big desk playing the powerful boss while your son-in-law handled the boring details." My father looked down at the dossier, but refused to open it. "Those were standard commercial bridge loans." He snapped, his voice losing a fraction of its booming confidence. "Chad negotiated a brilliant interest rate to fund the new downtown locations. Chad negotiated a complete transfer of assets." I corrected him, my tone dropping to a sharp, icy whisper. "Those were not commercial bridge loans, Dad. Those were leveraged asset transfers. Chad used every single one of your restaurants, the buildings, the equipment, the liquor licenses, as direct collateral for a massive offshore cryptocurrency firm. He convinced you to sign away the very foundation of your so-called empire to back his own digital gambling addiction." My father let out a harsh, dismissive laugh, but his hands were trembling as he finally reached out and flipped open the heavy leather cover of the dossier. "That is impossible," he stammered. "The bank would have called me. The board would have known. The crypto firm went completely bankrupt yesterday morning." I continued ignoring his weak protests. "The offshore accounts were frozen by federal regulators at midnight. And because your signature is on every single piece of collateral documentation, the creditors executed their seizure clauses at 5 o'clock this evening." I watched him flip frantically through the pages, his eyes scanning the highlighted sections, the forged addendums, and the undeniable proof of his own signature sealing his absolute ruin. His breathing became shallow and ragged. The deep purple color of his face drained away, leaving him looking sickly and pale. "You do not own the restaurants, Dad," I told him, delivering the final crushing blow without a single ounce of pity. "You do not own the corporate offices. You do not even own the company cars. By Monday morning, the bank will padlock the doors of every single location bearing the Marcus name. You handed your entire life to a con artist because he stroked your ego, and now you have absolutely nothing left." My father stared at the final page of the document, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. He dropped the papers, letting them scatter across the marble counter. His hands flew to the center of his chest, his fingers clutching tightly at the fabric of his expensive shirt, as he let out a choked, agonizing gasp. The invincible patriarch who had stormed into my home demanding absolute submission was now collapsing under the weight of his own monumental stupidity. My father remained frozen over the marble kitchen island. His massive hands gripped the smooth stone edge so tightly that his thick knuckles turned a sickly shade of white. The air in my penthouse suddenly felt incredibly heavy and suffocating as his paralyzing panic filled the room. He was gasping for air, taking in shallow, ragged breaths, while his eyes darted frantically across the pages of the open dossier. The harsh reality of his total financial ruin was finally crashing down on his shoulders, like a collapsing concrete building. I stood perfectly still on the other side of the counter, watching the man who had terrorized and controlled our family for decades finally break under the weight of his own monumental arrogance. He started muttering to himself. His voice was no longer a booming and intimidating roar. It was a pathetic, broken whisper that barely carried across the quiet room. He kept shaking his head back and forth, repeating that the banks were going to take absolutely everything. He mumbled that the federal regulators would seize the corporate accounts by morning and lock him out of his own life. Then he slowly looked up at me. His eyes were bloodshot and filled with a completely new kind of absolute terror. It was not just the fear of losing his restaurants and his social status. It was the distinct, desperate fear of a man who knew he had committed a massive, unforgivable crime. "Maya, you do not understand," he pleaded, his chest heaving heavily with every single word. "If the federal financial investigators look into those offshore crypto accounts, they are going to trace the initial capital back to the primary line of credit." I felt a slight shift in the atmosphere of the room. I looked at him and asked what primary line of credit he was talking about. He swallowed hard, wiping a thick bead of cold sweat from his deeply lined forehead. He confessed that 5 years ago, the commercial real estate market took a massive dive. He needed liquid cash immediately to keep the restaurant group afloat and maintain their wealthy lifestyle. He tried to get a standard bank loan, but the business was already severely over-leveraged. He tried to use Vanessa's credit history to secure the funds, but she had completely ruined her financial standing years prior. She had maxed out dozens of premium credit cards, funding her failed designer clothing boutiques and leasing luxury European vehicles she could never actually afford to maintain. He looked at me with a sickening mixture of deep guilt and unyielding entitlement. He said he needed a clean financial record to secure a $2 million corporate credit line from an aggressive private lender. He said he felt like he had absolutely no other choice. So he used my personal social security number. He forged my signature on dozens of federal banking documents. He committed flagrant identity theft to secure $2 million in high-interest corporate debt simply because I was the only person in the entire family who was responsible enough to have a pristine credit score. I stared at him, letting the absolute magnitude of his ultimate betrayal sink into the quiet space between us. My own father had actively committed federal wire fraud and identity theft, turning me into a massive financial liability just to keep his fraudulent empire from collapsing into dust. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his confession, the soft chime of my private elevator echoed clearly through the expansive foyer. The heavy mahogany doors pushed open and my mother rushed into the penthouse. She must have followed him here, terrified that his explosive temper would ruin whatever slim chance they had left to save themselves. Joyce was wearing an expensive designer cashmere coat, clutching her luxury leather purse tightly against her chest. She saw my father leaning heavily against the marble island, looking like he was about to have a massive coronary event right there in my kitchen. She immediately rushed to his side, placing a highly protective hand on his back. She glared at me, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure maternal outrage. "What did you do to him, Maya?" she shrieked, her shrill voice echoing sharply off the high vaulted ceilings. "Are you trying to kill your own father?" I did not raise my voice or react to her theatrics. I simply looked at her and laid out the cold, hard facts. I told her that her beloved husband did not just lose their entire business to their scam artist son-in-law. I told her that he had just confessed to forging my personal signature on a $2 million corporate credit line. I fully expected my mother to be shocked. I expected her to drop her expensive purse and look at him in absolute horror. Instead, the creeping panic in her eyes immediately shifted into aggressive and defensive annoyance. She already knew. She had known about the forged financial documents this entire time. She squared her shoulders and looked at me as if I was the one being completely unreasonable. "It is just a signature, Maya," she scoffed, waving her hand in the air like she was swatting away a minor annoying insect. "Families share their resources. We are a family unit, and we do what we have to do to survive. It is not a big deal at all. You never even used your credit anyway. You just sit at home reading your boring books and hoarding your little accounting paychecks. You never go on luxury vacations or buy nice things for yourself. Your father needed that credit line to provide for this family and to keep a nice roof over our heads. You should be honored that your pristine credit score could finally be useful to us." The sheer absolute delusion of her words hung heavily in the quiet air of my penthouse. She truly believed that stealing my identity and saddling me with $2 million of hidden corporate debt was a noble and necessary family sacrifice. She thought my responsible, quiet lifestyle was just a convenient, natural resource for them to exploit. They viewed me as nothing more than a disposable asset to be drained so Vanessa could keep buying designer handbags and my father could keep playing the wealthy, untouchable patriarch at the country club. I did not scream at her. I did not cry or beg them to understand how deeply they had violated my trust and my life. Emotional reactions were exactly what they wanted from me. They wanted me to yell and lose control so they could easily dismiss me as unstable and dramatic. Instead, I reached into the tailored pocket of my blazer and pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the digital screen and brought up the dial pad. I typed in a very specific toll-free phone number that I had saved weeks ago when my private equity firm first discovered the massive irregularities in their accounting books. I pressed the green call button and placed the phone flat on the cool marble surface of the kitchen island right next to the damning leather dossier. I pressed the speaker icon. The phone rang twice, sending a sharp trilling sound through the dead silence of the large room. My parents watched the phone, their expressions slowly shifting from arrogant annoyance to genuine creeping terror. A crisp professional voice answered the call, echoing clearly from the audio speaker. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division. How can I direct your call?" the voice asked. I looked directly into my father's terrified eyes. "Yes," I said, my voice completely steady and relentlessly calm. "I would like to officially report a $2 million case of aggravated identity theft and corporate wire fraud. I have all the physical documentation ready for immediate transfer to your field agents. And you might want to send your officers directly to my address. The primary perpetrators are sitting right here in my living room." The federal agents arrived at my penthouse exactly 12 minutes after my phone call. My parents had fled long before the sirens echoed through the downtown streets, scurrying out of my front door like roaches fleeing the light. I handed the agents the preliminary files and directed them to my legal team. By the next evening, the sheer gravity of the situation had completely suffocated the Marcus family. Bank accounts were frozen, corporate access was denied. The reality of federal prison was no longer a vague threat, but a rapidly approaching guarantee. I knew they would not just sit quietly and wait for the handcuffs. Desperation breeds stupidity, and my sister and her husband were two of the most desperate people I had ever known. It was nearly midnight when the security alerts on my phone silently triggered. I was sitting in the dark corner of my home office waiting. The heavy reinforced doors of my suite had been bypassed. Chad had always bragged about his connections with elite security firms, and it seemed he had called in one final expensive favor to clone my penthouse access fob. Footsteps moved frantically across the hardwood floors of the hallway. The door to my office pushed open and two shadowy figures slipped inside. It was Vanessa and Chad, temporarily united by their mutual absolute terror. The golden couple of Atlanta high society had been reduced to common burglars sneaking through the dark in dark designer activewear. "Hurry up and find the physical drives," Vanessa hissed, her voice trembling with panic. She always keeps physical backups. When we were teenagers, she used to hide her summer job money in a hollowed-out book on her shelf because she knew I would steal it if she left it in her drawer. She thinks exactly the same way now. Check the safe behind the modern art piece. I listened to my sister easily confess to a lifetime of casual theft while Chad frantically tore through my file cabinets. He was breathing heavily, tossing expensive leather folders onto the floor. "I cannot find them," he whispered aggressively. His voice sounded completely unhinged. "If she gave the hard drives to the feds already, we are completely dead, Vanessa. The offshore accounts are locked. My passport is flagged. If we do not find the audit drives, we cannot leverage a deal for immunity." "You are the one who ruined everything!" Vanessa shot back, her voice rising in hysteria. "You told my father the restaurant loans were totally safe. You told me the crypto firm was a guaranteed return. You promised me we would be billionaires by Christmas, and now I'm going to lose my country club membership and go to a federal penitentiary." "Shut up and look!" Chad snarled, tossing a heavy drawer onto the floor with a loud crash. "If your stupid father had not forged her signature, we would not be in this specific mess. You are all a bunch of incompetent fools." I decided I had heard enough of their pathetic marital counseling session. I rested my teacup on the saucer with a soft, deliberate clink. I reached for the smart home control panel built into the side table next to my armchair. I pressed a single button. The heavy office doors immediately slid shut behind them, engaging the electronic deadbolts with a loud, heavy mechanical thud. A split second later, the overhead recessed lights snapped on at full capacity, flooding the dark room with blinding, sterile brightness. Vanessa shrieked, stumbling backward into a heavy oak bookshelf. Chad spun around, throwing his hands up to shield his eyes from the sudden glare. I remained seated perfectly still in my high-backed leather armchair. I crossed my legs and picked up my delicate porcelain teacup, taking a slow, measured sip of chamomile tea. I watched the absolute horror wash over their faces as their eyes adjusted to the light and they realized I had been sitting in the dark corner the entire time. "Good evening?" I said, my voice completely calm and smooth, cutting through their frantic panting. "I must say, watching the two of you attempt a corporate heist is incredibly embarrassing. You could not even break into a home office without arguing about whose fault it is." Vanessa rushed forward, her face streaked with ruined, expensive makeup. She fell to her knees in front of my desk, clasping her hands together in a pathetic display of sisterly begging. "Maya, please!" she sobbed, her voice cracking. "You have to stop this. You have to call the federal agents and tell them it was a massive misunderstanding. They are going to arrest us. They are going to take my house and my clothes and my business. You cannot let your own sister go to a concrete prison cell. We just need the hard drives. We can leave the country tonight and you will never ever have to see us again." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no sadness, no lingering sense of family loyalty. "You stole from me your entire life, Vanessa," I said softly. "You stole my allowance when we were kids. You stole my parents' affection. You stole my peace of mind. And then you brought a man into this family, who stole my identity and my financial security. You do not get to beg for mercy when you are the one who built the guillotine. Chad realized the begging was completely useless. The polite, charming facade he used to manipulate wealthy people dropped completely. His face contorted into a mask of pure, violent rage. He looked at me not as a sister-in-law, but as the only obstacle standing between him and his freedom. "You smug, self-righteous witch!" he growled, taking a heavy, threatening step toward me. "You think you are untouchable, sitting up here in your high tower? You are just a bitter, lonely woman who wants to destroy everyone else because nobody ever loved you. Give me the drives right now. Maya or I swear to God I will take them from you myself." He lunged forward, a desperate wild animal charging directly at my desk. I did not flinch. I did not scream. I simply reached down and tapped the glowing screen of my iPad resting on the table beside my chair. The massive flat-screen television mounted on the office wall instantly blinked to life. It did not show financial documents or legal threats. It displayed a crystal-clear, high-definition live security feed of the luxury parking garage located securely beneath my building. Chad stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes darting to the massive screen. Vanessa slowly stood up from the floor, completely mesmerized by the live video feed. Down in the brightly lit concrete garage, two heavy-duty commercial tow trucks were actively backing into the VIP parking spaces. The video feed clearly showed a team of repossession agents securing thick, heavy metal chains around the axles of Chad's pristine silver Mercedes and Vanessa's custom white Range Rover. The flashing yellow lights of the tow trucks illuminated the dark garage as the hydraulic lifts engaged physically, pulling the expensive luxury vehicles off the ground. My sister let out a strangled, horrific gasp, pressing both of her hands over her mouth as she watched her ultimate status symbol being hauled away like common garbage. Chad stared at the screen, his mouth hanging wide open, his violent, aggressive charge completely broken by the reality of his total financial annihilation. I took another slow, elegant sip of my chamomile tea, savoring the rich warmth spreading through my chest. I set the cup down and smiled a genuinely warm and peaceful smile. "Your bank accounts are completely frozen," I told them, my voice light and conversational. "Your credit cards have been permanently declined. And as you can clearly see, the federal asset seizure process has officially begun. I suggest you bundle up because it is quite cold outside tonight." I picked up my iPad and looked back at my completely broken sister and her ruined husband. "You are going to need to call an Uber." I smiled. "But you might want to check if your payment method still works first." 2 weeks passed slowly since the federal agents raided the corporate offices of the Marcus Empire. Most people facing multiple federal indictments for wire fraud and identity theft would hire an aggressive defense attorney and lay incredibly low. But my parents were not most people. Their entire existence was built purely on the perception of untouchable wealth, and they firmly believed that as long as they looked highly successful, nobody would dare question their crumbling reality. In a move of absolute staggering delusion, my father liquidated his last remaining personal retirement account to fund a lavish 30th anniversary gala for his dying company. It was a desperate and highly calculated play. He rented out the grand ballroom of the most exclusive luxury hotel in downtown Atlanta, intending to pack the room with the city's wealthiest elite. He desperately needed to project an image of overwhelming strength to attract a massive influx of emergency capital. He genuinely thought he could charm his way out of federal prison by throwing one last extravagant party and tricking a new major investor into bailing out his sinking ship. I stood quietly across the street from the glowing hotel, watching the endless parade of luxury vehicles pulling up to the valet stand. The grand entrance was draped in dramatic cascading floral arrangements, and a long, plush red carpet led up the wide marble stairs. The soft sounds of a live jazz quartet drifted out into the warm night air, mixing with the bright flashes of hired event photographers. My father had hired a highly expensive private armed security firm to guard the front doors, ensuring that only the most elite members of society could witness his grand illusion. I knew this because earlier that afternoon, I had received a violently aggressive voicemail from my mother, explicitly stating that my name was permanently banned from the guest list. She told me that if I even dared to show my face anywhere near her perfect evening, the security guards had strict orders to arrest me for criminal trespassing. She wanted to make sure the ugly college dropout did not ruin their final desperate attempt at financial salvation. I simply smoothed the expensive heavy fabric of my custom-tailored emerald green evening gown. I had absolutely no intention of missing this party. I crossed the busy street, allowing the cool night air to brush against my bare shoulders as I stepped directly onto the edge of the velvet rope line. I watched the fake smiles and the hollow greetings of people who only cared about money and status. Before I could even reach the bottom step of the grand marble stairs, a shrill and terribly familiar voice pierced through the ambient noise of the arriving guests. "Well, look what the stray cat dragged in." I turned slowly to see Vanessa marching down the red carpet toward me. She was wearing a heavily beaded silver gown that I knew for a fact was rented because all of her personal credit cards were still permanently declined. She looked incredibly exhausted, her face pulled tight with the immense stress of the looming federal investigation, but she forced her features into a practiced mask of smug superiority. She stopped right at the edge of the velvet rope, crossing her arms tightly, and looking me up and down with absolute unfiltered disgust. Two large armed security guards immediately flanked her, glaring at me with their hands resting dangerously near their radios. "What part of you are completely banned? Did you fail to understand Maya?" She sneered, her voice loud enough to intentionally turn the heads of several arriving wealthy socialites. "This is an exclusive event for successful people who actually matter to this city. You do not belong here, and you never will. Security will arrest you if you step one foot on this red carpet, you ugly dropout." She smiled a venomous and victorious smile, clearly enjoying what she thought was her final moment of triumph. She believed she had finally put me back in my proper place beneath her. She leaned in a little closer, her voice dropping to a desperate and frantic whisper meant only for me to hear. "My father is securing a massive new investor tonight, Maya. He has been in private talks with Sterling Vance for months, and tonight Mr. Vance is coming here to sign a partnership that will save everything you maliciously tried to destroy. We are going to be richer than ever, and you are going to be nothing. So turn around and walk your pathetic self back to whatever cheap, miserable apartment you live in before I have these men drag you away in handcuffs." I did not respond to her desperate, unhinged rant. I did not show anger or fear. I did not need to. Instead, I looked past her silver-rented dress as a highly coordinated fleet of 4 pristine black Maybachs suddenly glided up to the illuminated curb. The entire red carpet went completely silent. The jazz music seemed to fade away, and the valets rushed forward, quickly opening the heavy armored doors of the lead vehicle. Excited and nervous whispers rippled through the gathered crowd as Sterling Vance stepped out into the warm evening light. He was a legendary and notoriously reclusive billionaire investor, known for making or breaking entire corporate dynasties with a single signature. He was a tall, imposing man with graying hair and an impeccably tailored suit that commanded immediate, absolute respect. He was the white whale my father had been desperately trying to harpoon to save his fraudulent legacy. Vanessa instantly abandoned her cruel and petty taunts toward me. She frantically smoothed the front of her rented dress and pasted on a dazzling, desperate smile, stepping forward to eagerly greet the man who was supposed to be her family's ultimate savior. "Mr. Vance," she cooed loudly, extending her hand with practiced, empty Southern charm. "We are so incredibly honored to have you here tonight." Sterling Vance did not even look at her. He walked right past her outstretched hand, leaving her completely frozen in a state of absolute shock and deep public humiliation. He did not acknowledge the eager photographers or the murmuring crowd. He walked directly toward the velvet rope, where I was patiently standing. The armed guards, who had just been threatening to physically arrest me, immediately parted, stepping respectfully and fearfully out of his way. He stopped right in front of me, his sharp, intelligent eyes taking in my emerald gown, and he offered a remarkably warm and respectful smile. He gently extended his arm toward me, completely ignoring the staring crowd and my absolutely horrified sister. "Shall we go in, Madam CEO?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly into the quiet night. The grand ballroom of the hotel was a masterclass in financial delusion. As Sterling Vance led me through the towering double doors, the sheer scale of my father's desperate final gamble became incredibly clear. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over dozens of tables draped in imported silk linens. Massive centerpieces of white orchids and rare lilies dominated the room, while waiters in crisp tuxedos circled with silver trays of top-shelf champagne. My parents had liquidated the absolute last drops of their personal wealth to construct this breathtaking lie. They had invited the wealthiest, most influential elite of Atlanta, hoping to blind them with luxury and charm them into signing away millions in investment capital to save an empire that no longer existed. The crowd of socialites and business moguls naturally parted as Sterling Vance walked me down the center aisle. Whispers rippled through the room like a sudden shift in the weather. Everyone knew who Sterling was, and his presence alone was supposed to validate my father's entire operation. Nobody dared to stop us. The armed security guards my mother had hired to keep me out simply melted into the shadows, terrified of offending the most powerful billionaire in the state. Sterling gently released my arm as we reached the front row, giving me a single respectful nod. He knew exactly what I was about to do, and he was simply here to watch the spectacular show. On the elevated stage at the front of the room, my father stepped up to a crystal podium. He looked every inch the distinguished, successful patriarch, wearing a custom velvet dinner jacket that masked the frantic, hyperventilating panic I had witnessed in my penthouse just days prior. My mother stood right beside him, wearing a heavily beaded sapphire gown, playing the role of the devoted and deeply blessed wife. The massive digital screens behind them displayed the golden Marcus Empire logo, rotating slowly against a sleek black background. My father tapped the microphone and the room fell completely silent. He smiled his famous charismatic smile, letting his deep booming voice wash over the audience. Friends, colleagues, and esteemed guests, he began placing a hand over his heart. We gather tonight not just to celebrate 30 years of the Marcus Empire, but to celebrate the enduring power of Black excellence. I started this company with nothing but a dream and a relentless work ethic. We built this legacy from the ground up, weathering every economic storm because we held fast to our core values: family unity, unshakable integrity, and a commitment to generational wealth. My mother dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, nodding along as the audience let out a soft murmur of admiration. We have always believed that a strong family is the ultimate foundation for a strong business. My father continued projecting pure, practiced emotion. Through every expansion, every new property, every challenge, we have stood together, united as one unbreakable front. And tonight, as we look toward the future and open our doors to new visionary partners, we promise to bring that same sacred familial devotion to every single investment. The hypocrisy was so thick, it was practically suffocating. He was standing on a stage preaching about family unity while actively hiding the fact that he had stolen my identity to commit federal wire fraud. He was talking about integrity while his son-in-law was currently watching his luxury cars being repossessed by the bank. I smoothed the fabric of my emerald gown and took a calm, deliberate step forward. I did not wait for his speech to finish. I walked past the front row of tables and headed directly for the short flight of stairs leading up to the stage. The soft murmurs in the audience shifted from admiration to confusion as they watched me ascend the steps. My father's booming voice faltered for a fraction of a second when he saw me approach, but his survival instincts kicked in immediately. He kept his wide, photogenic smile plastered on his face, while panic flashed wildly in his eyes. My mother reacted instantly, stepping away from the podium and moving smoothly to intercept me before I could reach the center of the stage. She grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging sharply into my skin through the fabric of my dress. She kept her face turned toward the audience, maintaining a bright, artificial smile while she hissed at me through completely gritted teeth. "What are you doing up here?" she whispered, her voice dripping with pure venom. "You are ruining this, just like you ruined your sister's sweet 16 when you refused to pay the catering bill. Get off this stage right now before I have security drag you out by your hair." I looked down at her hand and easily twisted my arm, breaking her painful grip without breaking my stride. I stepped right past her and walked directly up to my father. He instinctively threw a heavy arm around my shoulders, pulling me tightly against his side to make it look like a planned family moment. He squeezed my shoulder hard enough to bruise, silently threatening me to play along. "Ladies and gentlemen," my father announced into the microphone, forcing a hearty chuckle. "My wonderful daughter Maya. She has always been so eager to be part of the family business. She just could not wait until after the presentation to join us up here." The audience offered a polite, confused smattering of applause. I did not fight his heavy grip. I simply leaned forward and grasped the edges of the crystal podium, pulling the microphone slightly toward myself. I looked up over the sea of wealthy investors and focused my attention on the darkened sound and lighting booth at the very back of the ballroom. I raised my hand and gave a clear, deliberate signal to the young audiovisual technician sitting behind the glass. I had visited the venue earlier that morning and wired the young man $10,000 directly into his bank account. He already deeply despised my father because Marcus had a notorious reputation for stiffing event staff and independent contractors. The technician had been more than happy to bypass the official event planner and accept my alternative programming for the evening. The moment I gave the signal, the massive digital screens behind us violently flickered. The golden Marcus Empire logo vanished completely. In its place, a bright glowing red digital countdown timer appeared, filling the entire wall. It started ticking down the seconds in bold, relentless numbers. The audience gasped, collectively shifting in their seats as the ominous red light bathed the entire ballroom. My father's heavy arm suddenly dropped from my shoulder as he turned around to look at the screen, his charismatic smile completely disintegrating into an expression of absolute horror. My mother let out a sharp, terrified breath, covering her mouth with her hands. I pulled the microphone close to my lips, making sure my voice carried with perfect crystal clarity to every single corner of the lavish room. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice completely calm and devoid of any emotion. "You are not here for an investment gala tonight. You are here for a foreclosure auction, and I am the highest bidder." The moment the final word left my lips, the grand ballroom erupted into absolute chaotic pandemonium. The elegant and expensive illusion my parents had so desperately constructed shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of their eyes. The soft jazz music abruptly stopped as the hired musicians realized something was terribly wrong. Wealthy socialites and elite investors began murmuring loudly, their confusion rapidly shifting into deep, aggressive outrage as the reality of my announcement settled over the room. But the most satisfying reaction came from the actual creditors. Several men and women in sharp business suits, who had clearly been invited under the false pretense of finally receiving their overdue payments, suddenly abandoned their polite high society facades. They rushed the stage, swarming my father and mother, demanding answers and demanding the money they had been promised for months. My father stumbled backward, clutching the crystal podium as if it could somehow protect him from the angry mob of people he had systematically defrauded. He tried to use his booming, charismatic voice to restore order, but his words were completely drowned out by the shouts of angry investors, realizing their capital was gone. My mother simply covered her face, weeping genuine tears of absolute social destruction as the flashing cameras of the local press captured her total public humiliation. I did not stay on the stage to watch them be torn apart by the very people they had tried to manipulate. I had another loose end to tie up, and I knew exactly where to look. I slipped quietly down the side stairs, fading easily into the shadows of the panicked crowd. My eyes scanned the chaotic room, searching for the most cowardly rat in the entire building. It did not take long to find him. While Vanessa was shrieking near the buffet tables, desperately trying to explain the situation to her former country club friends and begging someone to help her, Chad was already making his move. I spotted his tailored tuxedo slipping through a set of heavy velvet curtains near the back of the ballroom. He was moving quickly and stealthily, shoving past confused guests and completely abandoning his wife and her collapsing family without a single backward glance. But what caught my attention was the heavy black duffel bag gripped tightly in his right hand. It was the secure deposit bag meant to hold the thousands of dollars in cash donations and entry fees collected at the front doors from the wealthy attendees. Chad was actively attempting to steal the last remaining liquid assets of the Marcus Empire to fund his own personal escape, leaving Vanessa to take the fall. I took a shortcut through the service corridors, navigating the familiar layout of the luxury hotel effortlessly. I reached the dimly lit coat check room just seconds before he did. The room was deserted, the staff having abandoned their posts to watch the unbelievable drama unfolding in the main hall. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, waiting in the quiet shadows. The heavy oak door pushed open, and Chad rushed inside, his breathing ragged and frantic. He froze the moment he saw me standing between him and the rear exit door. His charming golden boy facade completely dissolved instantly, replaced by something remarkably ugly and vile. He sneered at me, his eyes darting around the room to ensure we were truly alone before he let his true colors show. "Get out of my way, Maya!" he snarled, his voice dropping to a vicious and threatening tone. "You have done enough damage tonight. I am leaving, and you are not going to stop me from taking what I am owed." I stood my ground, looking calmly at the heavy bag in his hand. "You are leaving your wife to face federal agents while you run away with the door money?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You truly are the pathetic parasite I always knew you were." Chad lunged forward, closing the distance between us in two quick strides. He raised his hand as if to strike me, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. He started spitting the most vile, degrading racial slurs imaginable, showing the true, deeply rotten core he had always hidden behind his expensive suits and fake polite smiles. He told me I was nothing but an ugly, unwanted dropout who got lucky. He said I would always be an outsider, and that he was going to take the cash and disappear to a place where people like me were not allowed to exist. He stepped closer, trying to physically intimidate me into backing down. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or react to his disgusting words. Emotional reactions were for people who did not have a plan, and I had planned for every possible scenario. I simply looked at him with absolute pity and stepped gracefully to the side, leaving the path to the back exit completely wide open. "Run then, Chad," I said softly, a calm, peaceful smile playing on my lips. "Run as fast as you can." He barked a harsh, cruel laugh, genuinely thinking his aggressive tactics had successfully intimidated me into submission. He shoved past me, his shoulder hitting mine roughly as he sprinted for the heavy metal security door. He pushed the panic bar and burst out into the dark, damp alleyway, breathing heavily as the heavy door slammed shut behind him. I did not chase him. I simply walked over to the small, frosted window that overlooked the alley and watched him operate. He leaned against a dirty brick wall, resting the heavy duffel bag on a stack of wooden pallets under the yellow glow of a street lamp. He unzipped the bag with greedy, trembling fingers, desperately needing to see his stolen salvation to ensure his escape was funded. He reached inside and pulled out a handful of the contents. His face contorted in absolute confusion and then total, absolute horror. The bag was not filled with crisp $100 bills. It was filled entirely with shredded paper, specifically thousands of shredded glossy pages from Vanessa's failed vanity lifestyle magazines. He stared at the worthless shredded paper, slipping through his fingers, his mind struggling to comprehend how he had been outsmarted. I pushed open the small window above him and leaned out, resting my arms on the sill. I held up the actual canvas bank bag, heavy with the real cash, tilting my head as I looked down at the pathetic man standing in the garbage-filled alley. "Going somewhere, Chad?" I asked, my voice echoing clearly off the brick walls. The canvas bank bag felt substantial and heavy in my hand as I turned my back on Chad's pathetic whimpering in the dark alley. I walked calmly through the carpeted service corridors of the luxury hotel, leaving him to his worthless, shredded vanity magazines. When I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and re-entered the grand ballroom, the atmosphere had completely devolved into a beautiful, absolute catastrophe. The wealthy elite of Atlanta were no longer politely mingling and sipping expensive champagne. They were watching a financial empire violently burn to the ground in real time. My father was backed up against the crystal podium, sweating through his custom velvet jacket, as angry creditors and furious vendors shouted demands and waved legal notices directly in his face. But my eyes immediately found my mother. Joyce was standing near the edge of the elevated stage, her sapphire beaded gown catching the harsh emergency lighting that had suddenly flickered on across the venue. She looked completely lost and disoriented until her frantic, searching gaze locked onto me. She saw the heavy canvas bank bag in my hand. She saw the absolute calm peace settling over my expression. And in that exact fraction of a second, every remaining shred of her manufactured high society sanity violently snapped. She let out a sound that was barely human, a guttural, unhinged shriek that immediately silenced the shouting creditors and made the wealthy socialites physically step back in horror. Joyce lunged off the low stage, tripping slightly over the hem of her extremely expensive gown, but recovering with a wild, desperate energy. She charged directly across the polished ballroom floor, pushing past the city's most elite investors with her hands curled into shaking claws. "You!" she screamed, her shrill voice echoing violently off the high, vaulted ceilings of the grand room. "You are a demon. You are an absolute monster sent here just to destroy our legacy. You planned this all along, you ungrateful, wretched girl." I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, allowing her to close the distance. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, watching the untouchable matriarch of the Marcus family completely and totally unravel. Joyce stopped just inches from my face, her chest heaving heavily, her perfectly styled hair falling in wild, messy strands around her tear-streaked face. She raised her hand, trembling with pure, unfiltered hatred. "You were always a mistake!" she shrieked, the ugly, deeply buried truth finally tearing its way out of her throat for all of Atlanta society to hear. "You were a massive mistake, and I wish I never had you. I should have left you in the gutter where you belong. You are nothing but poison to this family." The silence in the room became absolute and suffocating. Even the most aggressive, angry creditors were stunned into total silence by the sheer venom of her words. A mother publicly declaring her own child a mistake in front of hundreds of peers was a level of staggering depravity that shocked even the most ruthless corporate tycoons in the room. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear or break my posture. I looked deeply into her wild, bloodshot eyes and felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of total freedom. The woman standing in front of me, screaming in her designer gown, was not a mother. She was just a desperate, pathetic thief throwing a massive tantrum because she had finally been caught in her own lies. I adjusted my grip on the canvas bag and spoke, my voice deadly calm and echoing with robotic, chilling precision through the dead silence of the ballroom. "A mistake," I repeated softly but clearly. "Let us talk about mistakes, Joyce. Let us talk about the spring ballet recital when I was 9 years old. You told me you could not attend because you had a terrible, debilitating migraine. But the actual truth was, you were at a luxury spa in Buckhead getting a highly expensive chemical peel on my father's platinum credit card. I waited on that stage for 20 minutes looking for your face in the quiet crowd. That was a mistake." Joyce's eyes widened slightly, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to comprehend how I could remain so incredibly calm while she was falling apart. "Let us talk about 4 years ago." I continued, stepping exactly 1 inch closer, forcing her to lean back to maintain her balance. "When you collapsed at the country club from what you publicly claimed was exhaustion, but was actually a severe toxic reaction to illegal imported weight loss pills. You begged me to cover the private clinic bill because my father had temporarily cut off your accounts to hide his failing margins. I paid exactly $24,650 to keep your humiliating secret safe. I paid it from the money I earned working late nights while you sat at luncheons telling your friends I was just a lazy, ungrateful dropout." She tried to speak to issue a denial, but no words came out of her mouth. The wealthy society women she had spent decades desperately trying to impress were now looking at her with open, deep disgust. "And let us talk about the exact dollar amount you stole from my personal savings account when I was 19, I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, unyielding whisper that carried immense weight. "You forged my signature on a banking withdrawal slip and took exactly $11,400 to buy a limited edition designer handbag because you absolutely could not stand the fact that another woman at your club had secured one before you did. You stole your own daughter's hard-earned college tuition money for a piece of dyed leather. You are not a victim tonight, Joyce. You are just a very bad investment finally hitting the very bottom of the market. My mother staggered backward as if I had physically struck her across the face. She looked wildly around the room, her eyes darting frantically from face to face, desperately seeking a single ally, a single person who would validate her delusion and comfort her. But there was absolutely no one. The entire room saw her exactly for what she truly was. Heavy, confident footsteps echoed loudly against the polished marble floor. The crowd parted respectfully and quickly as Sterling Vance walked slowly toward us. The famously reclusive billionaire looked completely unfazed by the highly dramatic scene playing out before him. He stopped right beside me, his tall, imposing presence casting a long, dark shadow over my trembling mother. He reached into the inside pocket of his immaculate custom suit jacket and slowly pulled out a crisp, rectangular piece of paper. It was the certified bank check my father had been practically begging for all night. The $10 million lifeline that was supposed to magically save their fraudulent empire from total permanent destruction. Joyce gasped audibly, her eyes locking onto the piece of paper like a starving woman seeing an absolute feast. "Mr. Vance." She breathed, her voice trembling with sudden pathetic desperate hope. "Please, you have to understand my daughter is deeply unwell. She is just trying to cause a scene to hurt us. If you just hand Marcus that check, we can move past all this nonsense and make you so much money." Sterling Vance looked down at her with an expression of absolute profound boredom. He did not say a single word to her at first. He simply held the $10 million check up directly in front of her tear-stained face so she could see the precise amount written on the line. Then, with a very slow, deliberate movement, he gripped the top edges of the paper and tore it straight down the middle. Joyce's knees buckled slightly as the crisp, sharp sound of tearing paper echoed in the quiet ballroom. Sterling calmly placed the two torn halves together and ripped them again, letting the useless, shredded pieces flutter down to the floor, landing perfectly on the toes of my mother's expensive designer shoes. "I only invest in winners," he said, his deep voice completely empty of any sympathy or warmth whatsoever. "And you, ma'am, are a monumental loser." The morning rain washed over the streets of Atlanta in heavy gray sheets, perfectly mirroring the bleak reality that had finally descended upon the Marcus family. I sat in the corner booth of a quiet upscale coffee shop downtown, holding a warm ceramic cup of espresso between my hands. Through the large glass windows, I had a clear view of the city, waking up to the news of the spectacular collapse. Just 3 blocks away stood the flagship restaurant of the Marcus dining empire. Yesterday, it was a beacon of artificial wealth and stolen success. Today, the heavy oak doors were chained shut, and large wooden boards covered the expansive dining room windows. Bright neon foreclosure notices were pasted aggressively across the glass, serving as a highly visible public obituary for my parents' fraudulent legacy. The media had already picked up the story, and the local morning news was entirely dominated by the chaotic events of the gala and the total sudden freezing of all Marcus family assets. I took a slow sip of my coffee, enjoying the deep, rich flavor and the absolute profound silence of my morning. For the first time in my entire life, I did not feel the heavy, suffocating weight of my parents' expectations or the sharp, stinging pain of their constant rejections. The empire they had built on the back of my stolen identity was gone, and I was the one who had finally dismantled it. The soft bell above the coffee shop door chimed, breaking my quiet concentration. I looked up and watched Vanessa walk inside. The visual contrast between the woman standing in the doorway and the arrogant socialite from the night before was absolutely staggering. Vanessa was completely soaked by the rain. She wore no designer coat and carried no expensive umbrella. Her usually perfect salon-styled hair was plastered in wet, messy strands against her cheeks. She was completely stripped of her heavy, expensive makeup, revealing pale, exhausted skin and dark, heavy circles under her eyes. She looked small, defeated, and entirely desperate. She scanned the quiet cafe frantically, her eyes darting from table to table until she finally spotted me sitting in the corner. She practically ran across the room, her wet shoes squeaking loudly against the polished wooden floor. She collapsed heavily into the chair across from me, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps as if she had been running for miles. I did not offer her a napkin or a warm drink. I simply set my espresso cup down on its matching saucer and waited for her to speak. She stared at me, her hands trembling as she placed them flat on the table. Her voice was raspy and broken, completely devoid of the mocking superior tone she had used against me my entire life. She started talking fast, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic stream of pure panic. She told me about the nightmare that had unfolded after I left the hotel. She described how federal agents had arrived at the family estate before midnight, tearing through my father's home office and seizing every single computer and financial document they could find. She explained how her own personal bank accounts had been completely frozen by dawn, leaving her unable to even buy a cup of coffee this morning. She leaned forward, trying to reach across the table to grab my hand, but I smoothly pulled my arms back, resting them in my lap. Her face crumpled and she began to weep openly right there in the middle of the quiet coffee shop. She begged me to listen to her. She said she understood that the restaurants were gone and that the business could never be saved. She admitted that our parents were going to face criminal charges and that their social standing in Atlanta was permanently destroyed. But then she shifted her focus entirely to her own personal survival. She told me the bank was already moving to seize her mansion in the suburbs. She sobbed heavily, saying her fancy country club friends had blocked her number and that she had absolutely nowhere to go. She begged me to pay off her mortgage. She pleaded with me to transfer just a few $1 million into a secure account so she could maintain her lifestyle and avoid the absolute humiliation of losing her home. She looked at me with wide, desperate eyes, trying to play the one card she had never once respected. "We are sisters," she cried, her voice breaking pathetically. "You cannot just sit there and let me be homeless. We are family, Maya." I looked at her over the rim of my espresso cup, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I studied the tears streaming down her face and remembered every single time she had laughed at my struggles. I remembered her mocking my clothes, my job, and my dreams. I remembered how she had happily worn diamonds bought with money stolen from my credit while I worked late-night shifts just to pay my rent. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and looked directly into her terrified eyes. "A week ago, you stood in my apartment and told me I was nothing." I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "A week ago, you looked me in the eye and said I would never survive without you, and without the protection of this family." Vanessa flinched, closing her eyes tightly as my words hit her. I took a slow, deep breath, enjoying the absolute finality of this moment. "It looks like you had it backwards, Vanessa." She opened her mouth to argue, to launch into another desperate plea for mercy, but she never got the chance to speak. Her phone chimed loudly, cutting through the quiet jazz music playing in the background of the cafe. It was a sharp, sudden sound that made her physically jump in her seat. She grabbed the phone from her pocket, her hands shaking so violently she could barely unlock the screen. She desperately hoped it was a lifeline, maybe her husband finally calling to tell her he had found a solution to their nightmare. I watched her read the message. I watched the very last ounce of hope completely drain from her body. Her skin turned an unnatural shade of gray and her eyes widened in absolute unadulterated horror. She dropped the phone onto the table as if it had burned her skin. She covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a muffled, choking sob that sounded like an animal in profound pain. I glanced down at the illuminated screen resting on the table between us. The text message was from Chad. It was a short, concise, and brutally final farewell. He stated clearly that he had boarded a private flight early this morning and was currently heading to a country in Eastern Europe that did not have an extradition treaty with the United States. He had taken whatever hidden offshore funds he could access and ran, leaving his wife completely behind to face the incoming storm alone. But the final sentence of the text message was the true, absolute death blow. He casually informed her that over the past 3 years he had routed all of his illegal kickbacks and stolen investments through shell companies registered exclusively in her name. He was safe overseas, but he had left Vanessa holding the bag for over $3 million in federal tax fraud. The authorities were not just coming to take her house. They were coming to take her freedom. I looked away from the glowing screen and picked up my espresso cup, taking one final satisfying sip. The sinking ship had finally reached the bottom of the ocean, and there were no lifeboats left. The transition from the coffee shop to the legal battleground was jarring but entirely necessary. The air inside the federal deposition room was thick stale and tasted vaguely of old coffee and quiet desperation. It perfectly matched the sterile, flickering fluorescent lighting that buzzed relentlessly overhead, casting long, harsh shadows across the faces of everyone present. We sat across from each other at a massive, polished mahogany conference table that felt far more like a battlefield trench than a piece of corporate furniture. On my side of the long table sat my lead attorney, a brilliant and utterly ruthless woman named Diane, along with two forensic accountants who had spent the last 48 hours surgically dissecting the rotting, decaying corpse of my parents' financial empire. On the opposite side sat my father and mother, looking completely and entirely unrecognizable. The custom-tailored velvet dinner jackets and the heavily beaded sapphire gowns from the gala were completely gone. In their place, they wore wrinkled off-the-rack suits and plain conservative blouses clearly instructed by their legal counsel to project an image of humble poverty. Their legal representation consisted of two visibly exhausted, overworked public defenders because every single high-priced defense attorney in the greater Atlanta area had demanded a massive cash retainer, upfront a retainer my parents could obviously no longer afford to pay. The federal investigators running the deposition sat at the head of the long table, recording every single spoken word with cold, terrifying efficiency. My father was currently in the middle of a deeply passionate and completely fabricated monologue. He was utilizing every single ounce of his remaining charismatic charm, desperately trying to spin a narrative of total, absolute innocence. He painted a highly tragic picture of a hardworking, honest family patriarch who had simply trusted the wrong person with the keys to his kingdom. He leaned forward, his voice trembling with perfectly manufactured grief, as he pointed the finger of blame entirely at his runaway son-in-law. He claimed that Chad was a master manipulator, a silver-tongued white con artist who had intentionally infiltrated their proud black family business and systematically destroyed it from the inside out, using his privilege to blind them. My father spoke at length about how Chad had maliciously isolated the company finances, how he had forged countless documents, and how my parents were nothing but trusting victims who had been completely blinded by their deep protective love for Vanessa. My mother sat right beside him, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a crumpled tissue, nodding emphatically as she played the role of the fragile, deceived matriarch who was just now discovering the horrifying truth of her ruin. I sat perfectly still, listening to them commit blatant federal perjury on a federally recorded line. I let my father finish his incredibly dramatic soliloquy. I let him dig the hole as deep as humanly possible before I finally decided to permanently bury him in it. When the room finally fell silent, the only sound being the soft hum of the recording equipment, my attorney Diane simply looked at me and gave a microscopic nod of approval. I reached down to my leather briefcase and lifted a thick, heavy manila folder, placing it directly in the absolute center of the polished wooden table. The dull, heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood made my mother physically flinch in her chair. I looked directly at the federal investigators and then slowly shifted my gaze to my parents. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the cold, robotic precision of someone reading a mathematical equation. "That is a truly fascinating story," I said, keeping my eyes locked onto my father's suddenly pale and sweating face. "It is incredibly moving, deeply emotional, and entirely fictional. Chad did not act alone, and you were absolutely not innocent victims in any of this." I opened the thick folder and began sliding documents across the wide table one by one, pushing them directly toward my parents' stunned public defenders. I laid out the certified bank statements, the international wire transfer logs, and the highly confidential internal company memos. When the restaurants first started failing 2 years ago, Chad did not hide the massive financial losses, I explained, ensuring every single word was captured clearly by the recording devices. He brought the problem directly to you. He pitched the embezzlement scheme as a temporary solution to keep the company afloat and maintain your public image. But the deal was not just about saving the failing business. You agreed to let him funnel the investor capital into his offshore shell companies on one very specific and highly illegal condition. My father opened his mouth to object, to shout a loud, aggressive denial, but the words died instantly in his throat as I slid the final and most damning document across the table. It was a private contractual agreement drafted completely outside of the official company network. You signed off on every single fraudulent transfer, I stated, raising my hand and pointing directly to the dark blue ink at the bottom of the page. You allowed Chad to systematically steal millions of dollars from your own friends, colleagues, and investors because he promised you a 20% direct kickback on every single stolen dollar. You deliberately routed that blood money into a hidden personal account specifically to maintain your luxurious lifestyle. You used stolen investment capital to pay for your exclusive country club memberships, your luxury imported cars, and your expensive designer gowns, while your own restaurant employees went without their basic paychecks. Your physical signatures are on the authorization forms. You sold your soul for 20%. The two public defenders stared at the documents, their faces completely draining of color as the horrifying reality set in. They realized their clients had just lied to federal agents and were now facing guaranteed lengthy prison sentences. My father collapsed back into his chair, clutching his chest as if he could not breathe, all the fake charm completely wiped from his existence. But my mother reacted with pure, desperate, unhinged fury. The fragile victim facade completely vanished, instantly replaced by the vicious, screaming woman from the gala. She slammed her hands down hard on the mahogany table, shouting at her lawyers, demanding they object, demanding they throw the forged documents out of the room. When her lawyers frantically told her to remain silent, she turned her blazing rage entirely onto me. She screamed that I was a jealous monster trying to frame them, and that she would hire the best, most ruthless defense attorneys in the country to destroy me in a court of law. She bragged wildly, completely losing her grip on her current reality. "You actually think you have won?" she shrieked, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at my face. "You think you can just leave us with absolutely nothing? I still have my private retirement accounts, Maya. I have a massive offshore fund that you and these pathetic federal agents can never ever touch. I will use every single penny of it to drag you through the mud for the rest of your miserable, pathetic life." I waited for her screaming to stop. I let the echo of her furious threats completely fade into the cold, sterile silence of the room. I leaned forward, resting my folded hands on the table, and looked her dead in the eyes, feeling nothing but absolute pity. "Are you referring to the secure account registered under that shell corporation in the Cayman Islands?" I asked, my voice dropping to a deadly, chilling whisper. "The one you thought was so perfectly and safely hidden from the authorities all these years?" My mother froze completely, her eyes widening in sudden, absolute panic, as she realized I knew exactly what she was talking about. "You might want to check the current balance of that account, Mom," I said, leaning back in my chair with a terrifyingly calm and peaceful smile. Because exactly 3 days ago, Vanessa figured out the routing numbers and the security passwords, and she drained every single penny you had left. My mother let out a small choked gasp, grabbing the edge of the table, as her legs seemingly gave out beneath her, causing her to slump sideways in her chair. Chad did not just leave her holding the bag for $3 million in federal tax fraud. I continued delivering the final, absolute death blow with surgical precision. He also left her owing a massive mountain of debt to some very angry and very violent underground bookies. Vanessa emptied your secret safety net just to pay them off so they would not find her and break her legs. You have absolutely nothing left. The heavy silence in the federal deposition room felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone present. My words hung in the sterile air, completely paralyzing the room. The revelation that Vanessa had drained the secret Cayman Islands offshore account to pay off violent underground bookies severed the very last thread of my mother's sanity. Joyce turned her head slowly toward her golden child, The color had completely drained from Vanessa's face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. Vanessa opened her mouth to form an excuse to shift the blame to Chad to claim she had no other choice, but she never even got the chance to speak a single syllable. With a guttural screech that sounded like a feral animal, Joyce launched her entire body across the wide, polished mahogany conference table. She did not care about the federal agents sitting just feet away. She did not care about the recording devices capturing every single second of her absolute degradation. She simply wanted to destroy the daughter who had stolen her ultimate salvation. Joyce's manicured hands curled into vicious claws as she lunged directly for Vanessa's throat. The heavy wooden table groaned under her weight as she scrambled over scattered legal documents and overturned water glasses. Vanessa shrieked in absolute terror, throwing her arms up to protect her face as her mother crashed into her. They tumbled backward in a chaotic tangle of limbs and tearing fabric crashing hard into the wall behind them. The deposition room immediately devolved into absolute unrestrained pandemonium. The two exhausted public defenders jumped out of their chairs, shouting frantically for their clients to stop pleading with them, to remember where they were. My father Marcus completely forgot his fabricated role as the innocent victim. He lunged into the fray, grabbing Joyce's shoulders and trying to physically drag her off his favorite daughter. But Joyce was possessed by the terrifying strength of a woman who had just lost her entire world. She swung blindly, catching my father squarely in the jaw and sending him stumbling backward over a heavy leather chair. He hit the carpeted floor with a heavy thud, cursing loudly and shouting vicious insults at both his wife and his daughter. Vanessa was sobbing hysterically, clawing at her mother's arms, screaming that she had to take the money because Chad's bookies had threatened to find her and break her legs. She screamed that it was Joyce's fault for trusting Chad in the first place, for being so greedy for the 20% kickbacks. I remained seated in my plush leather chair, completely and utterly motionless. I did not flinch when a heavy glass water pitcher shattered against the far wall, sending shards of sharp glass scattering across the carpet. I did not intervene when the federal agents rushed forward, shouting loudly for building security to breach the room. I simply sat there in the quiet eye of the storm, watching the grand, respectable Marcus family tear each other apart like starving wild dogs fighting over a rotten scrap of meat. This was the beautiful, unvarnished truth of my bloodline. There were no country club memberships here. There was no generational wealth or quiet dignity. There was only greed, selfishness, and an endless capacity for betrayal. They had spent my entire life telling me I was the defective one, the ugly college dropout who lacked the sophisticated grace to fit into their elevated world. But as I watched them physically brawl on the floor of a federal building, I realized with absolute crystal clarity that I was the only one in the room who possessed any real grace at all. I had not been rejected because I was less than them. I had been rejected because I was fundamentally better than them, and my presence had always been a quiet, constant threat to their fragile illusions. Two heavy-set security officers burst through the heavy wooden doors, rushing forward to physically pry my mother away from Vanessa. They dragged Joyce backward, pinning her arms to her sides, while she continued to kick and scream absolute obscenities at her weeping golden child. The federal agents ordered everyone to remain exactly where they were, declaring the deposition officially suspended and instructing the officers to detain my parents for immediate processing. The room was filled with the pathetic sounds of heavy breathing, chaotic sobbing, and the cold, harsh snapping of metal handcuffs being secured around my parents' wrists. I turned my face away from the pathetic scene playing out on the floor and looked completely calmly at my attorney, Diane. She sat right beside me, her posture perfectly straight, her expression entirely unreadable. She gave me a single respectful nod, recognizing that the ultimate victory had just been securely locked into place. I slowly lifted my left wrist and casually checked the time on my diamond-encrusted Cartier watch. The gleaming face told me we had been sitting in this miserable room for exactly 47 minutes. It was time to finally close out this dark chapter of my life forever. Diane opened her sleek leather briefcase and produced one final stack of heavily watermarked legal documents, placing them directly in front of me. This was the final acquisition paperwork for the entire Marcus real estate portfolio. Because of the massive, suffocating federal tax liens, the millions of dollars in fraudulent debt, and the total absolute collapse of the corporate entity, the actual market value of their 30-year legacy was technically less than zero. They owed far more than the properties could ever possibly generate in a single lifetime. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my favorite silver fountain pen. I smoothly and confidently signed my name on the bottom line of every single page, legally assuming total complete ownership of every building, every restaurant, and every single asset they had ever built. I was taking their entire empire not to save it, but to liquidate it on my own specific terms. When the final signature was complete, I reached into my small clutch purse. I pulled out a single crisp $1 bill. I placed it gently on top of the signed acquisition papers, sliding the entire neat stack across the polished mahogany table toward the federal agent sitting opposite me. "I just bought your entire 30-year legacy for exactly one single dollar," I said, my voice carrying clearly over my mother's hysterical sobbing and my father's desperate pleading. And to be perfectly honest, looking at what is left of it, I think I vastly overpaid. Exactly 1 month had passed since the spectacular collapse of the Marcus Empire in that suffocating deposition room. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my corner office at Obsidian Holdings, looking out over the Atlanta skyline. The city looked exactly the same, but my place in it had fundamentally and permanently shifted. The intercom on my sleek glass desk buzzed quietly. My receptionist informed me that a man claiming to be my father was causing a minor disturbance in the main lobby. He was refusing to leave until he spoke with the CEO. I did not send security to throw him out. I told my assistant I would handle it personally. I took the private elevator down to the ground floor, allowing myself a moment of quiet preparation. When the silver doors slid open, the visual contrast before me was almost difficult to process. The grand lobby of Obsidian Holdings was a masterpiece of modern architecture featuring polished black marble walls and minimalist leather seating. And standing directly in the center of this cathedral of wealth was Marcus. The untouchable patriarch of Atlanta high society was completely gone. In his place stood an aging, defeated man wearing an ill-fitting, heavily wrinkled gray suit that looked like it had been pulled from the back of a forgotten closet. The expensive custom tailoring he used to wear like armor had been replaced by frayed cuffs and a sagging collar. He was aggressively leaning over the reception desk, trying to use his authoritative voice to intimidate my security staff, but the booming volume was gone. It was replaced by a desperate, reedy tremor. I walked slowly across the polished marble floor, the sharp rhythmic sound of my heels immediately catching his attention. Marcus turned around, and the sheer physical toll of the last 30 days was etched deeply into every single line of his sagging face. He looked 10 years older. The arrogant fire that used to burn in his eyes had been completely extinguished, leaving behind nothing but hollow, desperate panic. He called my name, his voice cracking as he took a tentative step toward me. He thanked God I had come down saying my security team was trying to throw him out into the street. I stood perfectly still, maintaining a comfortable physical distance between us. I did not offer a greeting or a welcoming smile. I simply waited for him to speak. He swallowed hard, looking around the massive, expensive lobby with naked, starving envy. He nervously rubbed his hands together, stripping away the very last shred of his legendary pride. He told me they had lost absolutely everything. The bank had seized the family estate completely. The federal government had frozen the very last of their hidden accounts to pay off the massive restitution and the mounting legal fees. He confessed that he and Joyce had been living in a cheap, dirty roadside motel by the interstate for the past 2 weeks. The daily rates were rapidly draining the final bit of cash they had hoarded away. Joyce was completely falling apart, refusing to get out of bed and refusing to eat. I watched him play the victim, a role he had spent his entire adult life mocking others for playing. He looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, desperately trying to find the loyal daughter he had spent 3 decades throwing away. He admitted they had made mistakes and claimed he was blind to what Chad and Vanessa were doing. He begged me to understand the immense pressure he was under to maintain their public legacy. He pointed out how incredibly successful I was now, owning all the properties and holding all the capital. He lowered his head and begged for a handout. He pleaded for just enough money to rent a modest apartment somewhere safe, insisting that I could easily afford to set them up. He reminded me that they were my parents, and told me I could not just leave them to rot in the gutter because blood is thicker than water. The absolute audacity of his request hung heavily in the cool air of the lobby. He was standing in the headquarters of the company I built, from nothing begging for a handout, using the very same family loyalty he had repeatedly weaponized against me. I looked deeply into his exhausted, bloodshot eyes and felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of total peace. I did not feel anger and I did not feel sadness. I simply felt the final satisfying click of a lock snapping shut. I told him that blood is just biology. I explained that loyalty is family, and he had traded his loyalty for country club memberships a very long time ago. He did not make a mistake. He made a calculated financial decision to sacrifice his own daughter to protect his fraudulent public image. I reminded him that he watched Chad steal my credit and watched Vanessa drain my savings, while he happily cashed the 20% kickback checks, telling me I was a lazy, ungrateful disappointment. I made it absolutely clear that he did not get to invoke the sacred bond of family only after his stolen bank accounts hit zero. Marcus physically recoiled, as if I had struck him across the face. He opened his mouth to argue, to beg again, but I raised my hand, silencing him completely. I reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a single neatly folded piece of paper. His eyes immediately locked onto it, a pathetic spark of greedy hope flaring up in his expression. He reached his trembling hand forward, fully expecting a massive cashier's check or the deed to a luxury condominium. I placed the paper directly into his open palm. He unfolded it quickly, his eyes scanning the printed words. The greedy hope vanished instantly, completely replaced by utter profound humiliation. It was not a check. It was a standard blank employment application. I looked at him with cold, absolute finality and told him that if he wanted to eat, he had to work. I explained that the paper was a job application for a line cook position at the very same downtown soul food restaurant he used to pretend he built with honest sweat. The exact same restaurant I now owned entirely. I told him the starting wage was exactly $14 an hour and the shift began at 6 in the morning. I instructed him to fill it out completely and hand it to the kitchen manager, and if his background check cleared, he could start on Monday. I turned my back on the broken, begging patriarch of the Marcus family, leaving him standing completely frozen in the grand lobby. I walked back toward my private elevator, leaving him staring down at the single piece of paper that now represented his entire future. The sharp smell of fresh paint and pulverized drywall filled the warm morning air as I walked through the main courtyard of my newly acquired commercial plaza. My construction crews were already busy tearing down the gaudy gold-plated lettering that had spelled out my father's name for the last 2 decades. I stood near the marble fountain watching the heavy machinery dismantle the physical monuments of their arrogance piece by piece. I held a sleek leather portfolio containing the finalized blueprints for the entirely new development. The transformation was happening exactly as I had planned, and it was absolutely beautiful. I turned away from the construction site and started walking toward the north wing of the plaza, which housed the luxury retail spaces. My heels clicked rhythmically against the expensive pavement, echoing with a quiet authority that I had earned through years of unseen struggle. That was when I saw her sitting on a low concrete bench near the employee entrance of the high-end salon. Vanessa looked like a ghost haunting the ruins of her own miserable life. She was clutching a cheap brown cardboard box filled with what little remained of her personal belongings. Her appearance was a shocking departure from the untouchable socialite she had pretended to be just a month ago. The designer clothes she wore were stained and deeply wrinkled, hanging loosely on her visibly thinner frame. Her roots were showing a harsh, unkempt line of dull brown against her fading blonde hair, and her skin was pale and completely devoid of the expensive treatments she used to demand on a daily basis. When she heard my footsteps, she slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were sunken and red-rimmed, holding a level of pure, unfiltered desperation that I had never seen in her before. She stood up, her hands trembling as she held the cardboard box tightly against her chest. She did not sneer at me. She did not roll her eyes or attempt to deliver a cutting insult about my clothes or my job. Instead, she took a slow, hesitant step forward, looking completely terrified of the world around her. She spoke my name, her voice raspy and barely above a whisper. She told me she had been waiting for me to arrive all morning, hoping to catch me before I went into my office. I stopped walking, maintaining a comfortable distance, and simply looked at her, waiting for the inevitable pitch. She swallowed hard, her massive ego visibly choking her as she forced the words out of her throat. She told me the federal investigators had completely cornered her. The offshore accounts Chad had set up in her name were entirely exposed to the government, and the bankruptcy attorneys were threatening to throw her in federal prison for blatant fraud. She started crying right there on the concrete sidewalk, thick, heavy tears streaming down her face. She said the only way she could avoid immediate jail time was to prove to the court that she had legitimate, verifiable employment and a stable daily income to begin paying back the massive court-ordered restitution. She begged me for a job, any job at all. She sobbed uncontrollably, saying she would clean toilets, sweep the parking lot, or scrub the floors. She told me I was the only person left in the entire world who could save her from going to a federal penitentiary. She played the family card one last pathetic time, sobbing that despite everything, we were still sisters and I could not let her rot in a prison cell while I owned the entire city block. I stood perfectly still, watching her completely break down. Years ago, this exact sight would have broken my heart. I would have rushed forward, offering comfort and money, sacrificing my own stability to fix her endless mistakes. I would have let her walk all over me just to keep the peace. But that version of me had died a long time ago, starved to death by their constant cruelty and neglect. Now I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating sense of total closure. I looked at her tear-stained face and told her that I actually had a position available. Vanessa gasped, dropping the cardboard box onto the bench and clasping her hands together in desperate gratitude. She thanked me profusely, promising she would work hard and prove she had changed. I did not smile. I just turned and told her to follow me. I led her through the heavy glass doors of the luxury salon that she used to treat like her own personal kingdom. The interior was undergoing a massive renovation, but the main styling floor was already operational. The air smelled of expensive hair products and fresh lilies. Vanessa followed closely behind me, her eyes darting nervously around the familiar space where she used to snap her fingers at the staff and demand free services from people she treated like peasants. We walked past the sleek new styling stations toward the main manager's office at the back of the room. I told Vanessa that she would be working here maintaining the cleanliness of the salon and making sure the stylists had everything they needed. She nodded eagerly, saying she would do whatever the manager required without any complaints. I opened the glass door to the office and stepped inside. The new general manager was standing near the window reviewing a stack of inventory files. She had skin the color of deep, rich mahogany, and she wore her natural hair in a stunning, flawless crown of tight coils. She turned around holding a clipboard and gave me a warm, professional smile. Vanessa froze completely dead in her tracks, her breath catching sharply in her throat, as she instantly recognized the powerful woman standing before us. It was Keisha, the brilliant, highly talented stylist that Vanessa had ruthlessly bullied and publicly fired 4 years ago. Vanessa had thrown Keisha out onto the street claiming her beautiful natural hair and rich, dark skin simply did not fit the elevated luxury aesthetic that the Marcus family demanded. She had humiliated Keisha in front of a packed salon, trying to permanently destroy the young woman's career out of pure racist spite and shallow vanity. I had tracked Keisha down after the acquisition, knowing she was exactly the kind of strong, visionary leader this business needed to truly thrive. Now Keisha stood in the manager's office wearing a tailored designer suit, holding the absolute authority over the entire establishment. She looked at Vanessa with a calm, unshakable dignity that commanded instant total respect. Vanessa began to tremble violently, backing up a single step, as the horrifying reality of her new life finally crashed down upon her. She looked at me, her eyes begging for mercy, pleading for me to change my mind and put her anywhere else in the plaza. I casually adjusted the cuff of my blazer and looked directly into my sister's terrified eyes. I told Vanessa to meet her new boss. I informed her that her shift started immediately, and she was permanently assigned to towel washing duty in the back utility room. Exactly 1 year had passed since the day I purchased the ruins of the Marcus family empire for a single dollar bill. The crisp autumn air of Thanksgiving evening wrapped around my newly acquired private estate just outside the city limits. This house was a sprawling, beautiful sanctuary built of warm stone and expansive glass, sitting on 10 acres of pristine woodland. It was a stark, absolute contrast to the suffocating, rigid colonial mansion I had grown up in. Tonight, the house was alive with a vibrant, pulsing energy that resonated through the polished hardwood floors and echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. The rich, mouth-watering aromas of roasted turkey, savory cornbread dressing, honey-glazed yams, and perfectly spiced greens drifted from the massive open kitchen into the formal dining room. I stood near the arched doorway, simply watching the magnificent scene unfolding around my custom-built mahogany dining table. Every single chair was filled, but there were no blood relatives present. Instead, the table was surrounded by my chosen family. These were the people who had actually stood by me, who had protected me, and who had helped me rebuild my life from the ashes of my parents' deception. Diane, my brilliant and ruthless attorney, sat at the head of the table laughing genuinely at a joke told by my lead architect. Keisha, the salon manager who had completely transformed our flagship beauty center, sat next to them holding court and sharing stories that had everyone wiping tears of joy from their eyes. My closest friends, the mentors who had guided me, and the loyal employees who treated my business as their own, filled the rest of the seats. There was no screaming here tonight. There were no passive-aggressive insults thinly veiled as advice. There was no desperate jockeying for my father's approval or fearful tiptoeing around my mother's fragile, volatile ego. No one was forced to hold hands and bow their heads while a corrupt patriarch delivered a fake hollow prayer about family values and divine blessings. The only sounds filling my home were the clinking of crystal wine glasses, the passing of heavy porcelain serving dishes, and the loud, unrestrained laughter of people who genuinely loved and respected one another. I looked at the smiling faces around my table and realized with absolute clarity that this was what a real family looked like. It was not bound by biology or obligation. It was forged in the fires of mutual respect, trust, and unwavering support. I quietly slipped away from the joyful noise of the dining room and walked out onto the expansive stone balcony attached to the master's suite. The night air was biting, but refreshing, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. I leaned against the smooth stone railing, holding a glass of full-bodied red wine, and looked out over the rolling hills of my property. The moon cast a silver glow over the tall pine trees, creating a beautiful, serene landscape that belonged entirely to me. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, allowing the deep, rich flavors to ground me in the present moment. I had spent my entire childhood feeling like an ugly, defective outsider in my own home. I had spent my 20s desperately trying to earn the love of people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. But standing here on the balcony of my own estate, I felt a profound, unshakable sense of peace. The quiet vibration of my phone inside my blazer pocket interrupted my solitary reflection. I pulled the device out and glanced at the glowing screen. It was an urgent news alert from a major national media outlet. The headline was short and incredibly direct. It stated that fugitive con artist Chad had finally been arrested by Interpol agents in a cheap hostel overseas. Directly below that, the alert detailed that the Marcus family was currently facing a federal judge for their final sentencing hearing today. I stared at the glowing text for a long moment, processing the finality of those words. My father Marcus, the man who had traded his legacy for country club memberships, was going to federal prison. My mother Joyce, the woman who had happily spent stolen money while calling me a disappointment, would be trading her designer gowns for a standard-issue uniform. Vanessa, the golden child who had bullied and manipulated everyone around her, was already serving her time, likely washing towels in a prison laundry room, far away from the luxury she once demanded. They had lost absolutely everything: their wealth, their status, their freedom, and their dignity. A year ago, the thought of my family being sent to prison might have brought a brief pang of guilt or a lingering sense of tragic obligation. I might have questioned if I should have done more to save them from their own destructive choices. But tonight, as I stood under the cold autumn sky, I searched my heart and found absolutely zero pity. There was no toxic forgiveness waiting to be offered. There was no residual guilt clinging to my conscience. They had dug their own graves with their greed and their endless capacity for betrayal, and now they were finally being buried in them. I did not open the article to read the tragic details of their sentencing. I did not want to know how many years the judge had handed down or what pathetic excuses they had sobbed into the court record. They were ghosts to me now, lingering spirits of a past life that no longer held any power over my present reality. I pressed my thumb against the screen and calmly swiped the notification away, deleting it from my phone and from my mind forever. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and turned away from the dark skyline. Through the glass doors, I could see my real family gathered around the table, passing desserts and pouring fresh coffee. Their laughter drifted out onto the balcony, warming the chill in the air. I smiled a genuine, deep smile that reached all the way to my soul. I took one final sip of my wine, tasting the absolute sweetness of my victory. They had tried to burn my life to the ground, expecting me to perish in the flames of their financial crimes. But I did not just survive the fire. I had walked through the inferno untouched and emerged as the undisputed queen of the ashes. I opened the glass door and stepped back inside my beautiful home, leaving the darkness behind me forever. True family is not defined by blood or forced obligation. It is built on mutual respect, loyalty, and unconditional support. Maya's journey teaches us that walking away from a toxic environment is never a failure. It is a necessary step to claim your true worth and build your own empire. You cannot heal in the exact same place that broke you, and you do not need their validation to succeed. If you have ever had to leave toxic relatives behind to build your own success, please share your story in the comments below and subscribe to our channel for more.